Hello everyone, and welcome back to Midnight Horror. I know many of you use these videos to fall asleep, so before you drift off, I'd love it if you could leave a comment letting me know where you're listening from around the world. Also, don't forget to like and subscribe if you're enjoying the video. Story 1. The old mill by the river had always been there, standing crooked against the gray sky. Its windows were broken out long ago, and vines had worked their way through the cracks in the stone walls. People in town talked about it sometimes, mostly to warn kids to stay away. They said it wasn't safe, that it had been abandoned for a reason no one liked to discuss. I told myself I wasn't the type to listen to small-town stories. Curiosity had a pull stronger than caution, and one late afternoon I found myself walking the narrow path along the riverbank. The air smelled of wet moss and old wood as I approached the leaning structure. My footsteps echoed as I stepped onto the rotting porch and tested the front door. It creaked open with a little effort, revealing a large room full of broken machinery and tangled belts hanging from beams. Dust floated in the sunlight, streaming through a collapsed section of roof. I moved slowly, my boots crunching on the dirt-covered floor. Something about the silence inside felt heavy, as if the building was holding its breath. I wandered past rusted gears and thick wooden pillars, running my hand along rough surfaces as I went. Toward the back, I found a stairway leading down into darkness. It smelled damp, with a sharp undertone that made the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. Still, I gripped the railing and started my way down, each step creaking under my weight. The basement was colder, the air thick and still. My flashlight cut through the dark, illuminating stone walls and old wooden shelves lined with jars and rusted tools. There was a workbench against one wall, covered in stained cloths and glass containers. I moved closer, the beam of my light catching something white inside one of the jars. It took me a second to realize what I was looking at. Teeth. Dozens of them, packed tightly together in clear liquid. Each jar was carefully labeled, handwritten notes stuck to the glass. The closest one read 1973 in neat script. Next to it was another labeled 1974, and then 1975. The years stretched on in a line along the shelves. I followed the dates with my light, watching them tick closer to the present. Each jar was identical in size and shape, though the number of teeth inside varied. Some jars were nearly full, while others had only a small handful resting at the bottom. My stomach twisted as I realized many of the teeth were clearly from children, tiny molars and incisors mixed in with larger ones. At the end of the row was the most recent jar. The label read 2025, the same year carved into the calendar back at home. This jar was only partially filled, maybe a third of the way, leaving plenty of space at the top. It was as though whoever had been collecting them was still working on it. The thought sent a cold weight settling deep in my chest. I backed away from the shelves, my flashlight shaking slightly in my grip. Every instinct told me to leave, but something kept me rooted in place for a moment longer. On the floor near the table was a wooden crate, its lid propped open. Inside were small tools, pliers, picks, and clamps stained dark with age. Next to the crate was an old leather apron, its surface stiff and cracked. The sound of water dripping somewhere deeper in the basement echoed faintly, but I couldn't convince myself I was alone. My breath was loud in the quiet, each exhale sounding harsh and unnatural. Slowly I turned back toward the stairs, taking careful steps in reverse. That's when I noticed something else on the far wall. It was a series of hooks, each holding a long strip of cloth. At first glance they looked like rags, but as I stared, I realized they were numbered too, small tags hanging from each one. Some were stained, others clean, but they all seemed deliberate in their arrangement. I didn't want to get close enough to see what they really were. The sound of footsteps above me made my heart lurch into my throat. They were slow, heavy, crossing the floor overhead. I froze in place, barely breathing as I tilted my light upward toward the ceiling. Dust rained down from between the boards with each footstep, marking their path as they moved toward the top of the stairs. I killed my flashlight and crouched down low, pressing myself against the cold stone wall. Whoever it was stopped at the stairwell entrance. For several long seconds there was no sound at all. Then a slow creak as weight settled onto the first step. I stayed completely still, my body screaming for me to move, but my mind refusing to make the decision. The steps came slowly, measured, as though whoever it was knew I was there. I couldn't see anything in the dark, but I could feel the air shift as they drew closer. The steps paused halfway down, then retreated. Each tread groaned as they moved back up to the floor above. A door slammed shut a moment later, and silence returned. I didn't wait. I bolted for the stairs, not caring about the noise I made as I stumbled up them two at a time. I burst through the door at the top and didn't stop until I was back out in the overgrown field, breathing hard and glancing over my shoulder. The mill stood silent again, its windows dark and empty. I made it back to my truck with my hands shaking and my heart pounding. I didn't tell anyone what I found there. Some part of me knew they wouldn't believe me, and another part knew it wouldn't matter if they did. That place had been waiting for someone, and it could just as easily wait again. I still think about that last jar sometimes, how much space was left inside, and how it wasn't full yet. Story 2. The old funeral home sat at the end of a forgotten road, tucked between overgrown trees and sagging fences. Its windows were smeared with grime, and the paint on the wooden siding had long since peeled away. I stood out front for a long time, just staring at the place. It looked hollow, like it had been waiting for someone to come inside. I had heard the stories about it, how the owner shut the doors overnight and vanished without explanation, how people in town whispered about strange lights and noises from the building long after it was abandoned. I hadn't believed any of it. I told myself I was just curious, just exploring. The front door was unlocked. It creaked open with a low groan that sounded too loud in the quiet. Inside, the air was stale, thick with the smell of old wood and dust. The foyer had once been polished and bright, but now it was dull and faded. A cracked chandelier hung above the entryway like a skeleton. I walked slowly down the main hallway, my boots scuffing against warped floorboards. Faint light from the windows caught on faded wallpaper and tarnished sconces. The chapel was empty, rows of wooden pews gathering dust under heavy curtains. An open door at the far end of the hall drew my attention. The embalming room was colder. I don't know if it was the concrete floor or something else, but the temperature dropped as I stepped inside. The room was clean, too clean for a place left untouched for years. The stainless steel table in the center gleamed faintly. A tray of tools sat beside it, each one polished and arranged with care. At the head of the table was a handwritten sign. The letters were neat, almost careful. It read, "Next appointment, you." I stared at it for what felt like a long time. My first thought was that someone else had been here recently playing a sick joke, but the tools were too pristine. The room smelled faintly of disinfectant. I took a step back, and the floor creaked beneath me. The sound echoed in the tiled space, sharp and hollow. I turned toward the door, my heartbeat quickening. I told myself to leave, to get out before whoever had set this up came back. But something kept me rooted in place. A faint tapping sound came from the far corner of the room. I swung my flashlight toward it, the beam cutting through the dimness. There was nothing there. The corner was empty, just a stained sink and an old cabinet. But the tapping came again, softer now, like fingernails against glass. I moved slowly toward the cabinet, each step making the floor groan. I reached out and pulled the door open. Inside were empty jars and cracked porcelain trays. Nothing unusual, but the tapping stopped the moment I touched it. I closed the cabinet and turned back toward the table. The sign was gone. I froze. My hands were shaking now, and I could feel a cold sweat on the back of my neck. I scanned the room again, trying to find it. There was no sound, no movement, just that strange, heavy silence. The metal table gleamed brighter now, like it was reflecting more light than it should have. I took another step back, and something crunched underfoot. I looked down and saw shards of glass scattered across the floor, as if a jar had just been smashed there, but I hadn't heard anything break. I knelt down, shining my flashlight over the pieces. They were clean, no dust on them. I straightened up quickly, my pulse pounding in my ears. That's when I noticed the shadow on the wall behind the table. It didn't belong to me. It was the shape of a person, standing perfectly still. I backed away slowly, but the shadow didn't move. It stayed there, solid and dark, as if painted onto the wall. Then it raised its hand. My breath caught in my throat. I turned and ran toward the door, stumbling over the uneven floor. I didn't look back. The hallway outside was darker than before. The air was thicker, harder to breathe. I moved fast, trying to ignore the sound of footsteps behind me. They were soft but steady, keeping pace no matter how fast I went. I reached the front foyer and grabbed the door handle. It wouldn't budge. I yanked hard, but it was like the door had been welded shut. The footsteps stopped. I turned around slowly. The hallway was empty, but the air was colder now. Frost had begun to creep along the edges of the cracked windows. I spotted another door leading deeper into the building. I didn't want to go that way, but I had no choice. I pushed through it and found myself in a narrow service corridor. Pipes ran along the ceiling, dripping water that echoed as it hit the concrete floor. The corridor twisted and turned, leading me to another room. It was another preparation area, smaller and more cluttered. Rusted equipment lined the walls and old bottles sat in cracked cabinets. On the counter was another handwritten sign. It read, "You're late." I felt the cold breath of something pass by my ear. I spun around, but there was nothing there. The lights flickered overhead, casting strange shadows on the walls. I didn't stay. I bolted through the next door and found a narrow staircase leading down. The basement smelled worse than the rest of the building. Damp earth, mold, and something else I couldn't place. The walls were stone, rough and wet to the touch. I moved quickly, my flashlight shaking in my hands. At the end of the hallway was a heavy door. It was slightly open, and a faint light glowed from within. I pushed it open and found myself back in the embalming room. But this time the table wasn't empty. A shape lay beneath the sheet, perfectly still. The tools were arranged around it, gleaming. The sign had returned, pinned to the chest under the sheet. "Next appointment, you." I backed away slowly, but the door slammed shut behind me. The lock clicked into place. I pounded on it, but it didn't budge. The light overhead dimmed as the sheet on the table began to move. I don't remember much after that. Someone found me the next morning wandering the road outside town. They said I was pale, shaking, my eyes wide and empty. I don't know how I got out of there, but I can still feel the cold of that table. And sometimes when it's quiet, I swear I hear footsteps behind me. Story 3. The old prison was scheduled to be torn down in a few weeks. I had driven by it countless times, always wondering what it looked like inside. One overcast evening, curiosity got the better of me, and I decided to break in. The fence surrounding the property wasn't much of a challenge, and once I found an open window on the ground floor, slipping inside was easier than I expected. The air was thick with dust and the scent of mildew. Every step I took echoed in the empty hallways, making me constantly glance over my shoulder. Rusted cell doors stood open in long rows, their hinges groaning when the breeze moved through. Pieces of ceiling tile littered the ground, and graffiti covered nearly every surface I passed. I started on the first floor, moving slowly and taking in the eerie silence. The cell blocks were all empty, except for a few rusted bed frames and the occasional pile of debris. I ran my hand along one of the iron bars, surprised by how cold it felt despite the warmth outside. The deeper I went into the building, the heavier the air seemed to grow. There was a stairwell at the end of the hall that led to the upper tiers. I climbed cautiously, testing each step before putting my weight on it. The second level was darker, the windows more broken and boarded up. I flicked on my flashlight, the beam cutting through the thick shadows in front of me. Most of the cells on this floor were much the same as below, empty and silent. But one door near the far end was closed. The rusted lock snapped clean off and lying on the floor. Something about it felt different from the rest, though I couldn't explain why. I hesitated for a moment before pushing the door open with my foot. The room was small, just like the others, but the walls immediately caught my attention. They were covered in tally marks, scratched deep into the concrete with something sharp. Hundreds of them, maybe thousands, all carved with uneven lines. The longer I stared, the more it made my skin crawl. I stepped inside, shining my flashlight over every inch of the space. The bed frame in the corner was rusted, the thin mattress torn open and spilling rotten stuffing. On the metal slats of the frame, something had been scratched repeatedly. The words "Don't let them in" were carved over and over again, filling nearly every inch of space. Some of the carvings were shallow and rushed, while others had been dug so deep they twisted the metal. There was something desperate about them, like whoever did it couldn't stop. I ran my fingers along one of the deeper grooves, feeling the jagged edges where the metal had bent. I turned my attention back to the walls. The tally marks weren't in neat rows, they were chaotic, some overlapping and others so faint I could barely make them out. A few marks were scratched into the ceiling above the bed, as if whoever made them had stretched as high as they could reach. I tried to imagine how long it would take to make that many. Something about the room felt wrong. The air was colder here than in the rest of the building, and it smelled faintly of rust and something else I couldn't place. I stepped back toward the doorway, but stopped when I noticed scratches on the inside of the door itself. Long, deep gouges ran down the metal, as if someone had clawed at it in panic. I shone my flashlight at the corners of the room, half expecting to see something moving. But there was nothing, just the empty cell, silent and cold. Still, the longer I stood there, the more I felt like I was being watched. My skin prickled, and I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone anymore. I backed out of the room slowly, keeping my light fixed on the far wall until I was in the hallway again. Once outside the cell, I took a deep breath, but it did little to calm me. I turned to leave, but as I did, I noticed something odd. The other cell doors, all of which had been open when I passed them earlier, were now closed. The hall was completely still, yet I could swear I heard something faint in the distance. A scraping sound like metal dragging against metal. I stayed frozen in place, listening hard, but it stopped as quickly as it had started. I glanced back toward the cell I had just left. Its door was still open, but the darkness inside seemed even deeper than before. I forced myself to keep moving, heading back toward the stairwell. My footsteps echoed in the emptiness, each one sounding louder than the last. The weight of this silence pressed in on me until I could feel my heartbeat in my ears. I told myself it was just an old building settling, but that did nothing to quiet the growing sense of dread. When I reached the stairwell, I heard it again, the faint scraping sound, but this time closer. I hurried down the stairs, nearly slipping on the dusty steps. At the bottom, I didn't stop. I made for the window I had come in through, not daring to look behind me. Every instinct screamed to get out as fast as I could. As I climbed back out, I thought I heard a whisper, low and strained, but I couldn't make out the words. I didn't stick around to listen. Once outside, I sprinted across the yard, not stopping until I was well beyond the fence. Only then did I risk looking back. The building stood there, silent and crumbling, but I could still feel something watching me from one of the broken windows. Even now, I think about that cell, about the thousands of tally marks, the desperate warnings carved into metal, and the strange cold that seeped into my bones. I still wonder who was kept in there, and more than that, what it was they were so desperate to keep out. Story 4. The Victorian house sat at the end of a long, winding road lined with ancient oaks. Its gray facade was chipped and weather-worn, but something about the place drew me in. The real estate agent said it had been on the market for years with no serious offers. I wasn't surprised houses that looked like this usually came with stories people didn't like to talk about. Inside, it was quiet. Dust hung in the air like fog, and the wooden floors creaked beneath my feet as I walked from room to room. Each space was furnished as if someone had just stepped out for a moment and never returned. Faded curtains hung limp at the windows, and the wallpaper peeled in long, brittle strips. I followed the agent upstairs, taking careful steps up the narrow staircase. The second floor was darker than the first, the only light coming from a few grimy windows at the end of the hall. She pointed out the bedrooms as we passed them, her voice distant, like she was reading from a script she'd memorized long ago. When we reached the nursery, she hesitated before turning the knob. Her fingers hovered over it for a second too long. Then she opened the door and stepped back to let me enter first. The air in the room was colder than the rest of the house. I rubbed my arms as I crossed the threshold and looked around. The nursery was small, with a single window facing the street. Against the far wall was an old wooden crib, its white paint chipped and yellowed with age. On the floor, a thick layer of dust dulled the once bright colors of a braided rug. What caught my eye, though, were the dolls. Dozens of them lined the windowsill, each one carefully arranged to face outward. They were old-fashioned, with porcelain faces and glass eyes that seemed too lifelike. Some smiled sweetly, others wore blank expressions, and a few had faint cracks running through their painted features. Their dresses were faded, but many of them still had lace bonnets and tiny shoes. I moved closer, feeling uneasy under their silent stares. At the base of the window sat an object half hidden beneath one of the dolls. I reached out and lifted the doll aside, revealing an old baby monitor. It was the kind from decades ago, yellowed plastic and a long antenna extending from the top. To my surprise, it was on. The static hissed softly, a low white noise that buzzed faintly in the room. I leaned in, curious, listening more closely. Beneath the static, I thought I heard something else, whispers. At first they were faint, barely noticeable, but then they grew clearer, though I couldn't make out the words. It was like someone was speaking just out of reach, their voice slipping in and out. I turned toward the agent, but she was standing stiffly in the doorway, avoiding my eyes. "Does the monitor work?" I asked. She shrugged without answering. Her hands were clenched tight around the folder she carried, knuckles white. I bent down and picked up the monitor. It was cold in my hand, the plastic cool despite the warmth of the room. There were no cords, no sign of where it might be plugged in or connected to anything. Still, the whispers continued, rising and falling like a conversation just beyond understanding. The longer I held it, the more unsettled I felt. I placed it back where I found it and stood. The dolls on the window seemed closer than before, as if they'd shifted slightly when I wasn't looking. I backed away, glancing around the room for anything else out of place. There was a rocking chair in the corner. Its cushion was faded pink, the wood darkened with age. It began to move gently back and forth, the floor creaking with the rhythm. No one was near it, and there was no breeze. I watched it for a long moment, unable to convince myself it was a trick of my eyes. I turned to leave, but something made me pause. A faint cry like that of a baby came from the monitor behind me. It was soft but unmistakable. The sound made my skin prickle, and I glanced over my shoulder. The dolls remained where they were, but their eyes seemed sharper, watching. I stepped into the hallway, eager to be away from the nursery. The agent closed the door quickly behind me, her expression tight. Neither of us spoke as we made our way back down the stairs. Each creak underfoot sounded louder now, as if the house was reacting to our every move. When we reached the front door, I glanced back. The nursery window was visible from the porch, and I saw the row of dolls still facing outward. I could have sworn one of them had turned slightly, its head angled toward me. I blinked, and it was back in line with the others. Outside, the air felt lighter, and I took a deep breath to steady myself. The agent handed me a business card, her hand shaking just slightly. "If you're interested," she said, though her tone made it sound more like a warning than an offer. I nodded and slipped the card into my pocket, unsure if I would ever call. Driving home, I kept thinking about the monitor. How had it been working after all this time? And what were the whispers I heard through the static? The longer I thought about it, the less certain I became that I wanted to know the answers. That night, I lay in bed staring at the ceiling. I thought I'd imagined the whole thing until I heard it again. A faint static noise followed by a soft, distant whisper. It seemed to come from the corner of my room, just beyond the edge of sight. I didn't move. I barely breathed. The sound faded slowly, but I didn't sleep at all. In the morning, I checked my phone and found the agent's business card on the nightstand. I could have sworn I'd left it in my coat pocket. I threw it away, but sometimes I hear static in the quiet moments, soft whispers that I can't quite understand. And every time, I picture that nursery window lined with dolls waiting. Story 5. I had always been curious about the old subway tunnels beneath the city. They were sealed off years ago after a fire in one of the main stations. People told stories about what was down there: rats the size of dogs, lost travelers who never came back, and strange sounds echoing through the dark. It sounded like urban legends, but I couldn't resist seeing it for myself. I found an entrance through an abandoned maintenance hatch behind a crumbling brick wall. It was hard to squeeze through, but once I was in, the air turned cold and damp. The smell was thick mildew, rust, and something sour I couldn't place. My flashlight cut through the darkness, the beam flickering along the old concrete walls. The tunnel stretched out in both directions, empty and silent. Graffiti covered the walls, most of it old and faded. Occasionally I saw newer markings, fresher paint, and that made me uneasy. It meant someone had been here not long ago, though I saw no footprints in the dust. I followed the tunnel for what felt like an hour, listening to the sound of my boots scuffing the floor. The further I went, the more claustrophobic it felt. The air got heavier, the silence pressing in until I could hear my own heartbeat pounding in my ears. Then I saw a door. It was metal and rusted but still intact. The faded letters above it read maintenance in peeling paint. I pulled on the handle, expecting it to be stuck, but it swung open with a loud groan that echoed down the tunnel. The smell from inside was worse, like something rotting under the floorboards. The room was cramped, lined with broken shelves and shattered equipment. Old light fixtures hung from the ceiling by frayed wires. I swept the flashlight around, landing on a pile in the corner. As I got closer, I realized it wasn't just garbage. There were wallets, purses, backpacks. Some looked like they'd been there for decades, leather cracked and crumbling, cloth faded and torn. They were stacked in neat piles like someone had placed them there with care. It was strange because everything else in the room was a mess. I crouched down to get a better look, sifting through a few of the bags. Most were empty, though some still held ID cards, brittle and faded photographs, old receipts. Everything was decayed and forgotten, untouched for years. Then I saw one backpack that was different. It was sitting on top of the others, not dusty or rotted. The fabric was bright, the zippers free of rust. It looked like it had been dropped there only moments before I arrived. My chest tightened as I unzipped the main pocket, half expecting something to leap out at me. Inside was a sandwich. Fresh. The bread was soft, the lettuce crisp, and I could smell the sliced meat as if it had just been made. No mold. No sign of decay. It didn't make sense. I touched the sandwich, expecting it to dissolve or crumble like the rest of the junk in the room. It didn't. I let go of the backpack and stepped back quickly. That was when I noticed something else. There were footprints in the dust leading to where I stood, but none leading away. They were small, about my size, and they ended right where I was standing. The air grew colder as I tried to process what I was seeing. I looked back at the door, ready to leave, but something caught my eye in the corner of the room. Another door, smaller, almost hidden behind a broken cabinet. It was slightly open. I knew I should have turned around. I should have left and never come back. But I walked over and pulled the door open wider. Beyond it was another room, darker and more cramped. My flashlight flickered as I stepped inside, sweeping the beam across the walls. There were more piles, shoes, clothes, watches, everything stacked carefully like an inventory. A sick feeling churned in my stomach as I realized some of the clothes weren't old. Some were clean, folded neatly like they had just been laundered. I heard something move behind me, a shuffle of feet on concrete. I turned fast, but no one was there. My flashlight flickered again, and for a moment I thought I saw a shadow, something hunched low to the ground, skittering into the dark. But when the light steadied, I was alone. I backed out of the smaller room and closed the door behind me. The maintenance room suddenly felt tighter, the air thicker. My skin crawled as I stared at the backpack with the sandwich again. I knew someone had been here. Someone was still here. I forced myself to leave the room, stepping back into the tunnel. I tried to move fast, but I kept hearing things' footsteps echoing mine, soft breathing close to my ear. Every time I turned, there was nothing. I kept going, focusing on the faint circle of light from my flashlight. I saw the maintenance hatch ahead, the faintest sliver of daylight leaking through the edges. Relief washed over me, and I hurried forward. But just before I reached it, I saw something else on the wall. Another pile of belongings, more wallets, another backpack. This one was mine. The one I was carrying when I came in. I didn't understand how it got there. My hands were empty. I hadn't noticed losing it. I stared at it for a moment before grabbing the edge of the hatch and pulling myself up and out into the open air. I didn't look back until I was several blocks away. I didn't tell anyone about what I found down there. But sometimes I dream about that sandwich. I can still smell it fresh, clean, like it was made just for me. And I keep wondering, if I had taken a bite, what would have happened next? Story 6. I had been looking forward to the trip for weeks. The cabin was remote, exactly the kind of isolation I wanted after a long, exhausting stretch at work. My friend had told me about it, said it was a good place to clear your head. He didn't mention anything strange, just that it was old but comfortable enough for a few days away. The drive out there took most of the afternoon. Dirt roads wound through endless trees, the sky dimming long before the sun was due to set. By the time I reached the clearing, I was starting to feel the weight of the distance behind me. The cabin stood alone at the edge of the tree line, weathered but sturdy. Inside, it was simple. One large room with a bed, a table, and a fireplace. The walls were paneled in dark wood, and the single window was small, facing the thick woods beyond. It had a strange, heavy silence about it, but I told myself that was just the lack of traffic noise I'd gotten used to back home. After unpacking, I made a quick dinner and ate by the fireplace. There was no cell service out here, which didn't surprise me. I tried reading a book one brought, but I kept losing focus, my eyes drifting to the shadows gathering in the corners of the room. I shook it off and decided to call it an early night. When I pulled back the blanket on the bed, something strange caught my eye. Tucked behind the nightstand was a photo frame, half hidden in the dark. Curious, I picked it up. The photo inside was black and white, showing a man sleeping in the same bed. His face was peaceful, but something about the angle seemed wrong, like it had been taken from the foot of the bed without him knowing. I looked around and saw more frames hanging on the walls. I hadn't noticed them earlier, but there were dozens. Each one showed a different person asleep in the same bed I was about to lie in. Some were recent in color, while others were old, faded. None of them looked posed. They all seemed unaware they were being watched. I stood there, heart beating faster, staring at photo after photo. There were men and women, all different ages. Some photos were grainy and blurred, others sharp and clear. It felt invasive just looking at them, and I had a hard time shaking the feeling that their stillness was more unsettling than it should have been. Then I saw the most recent one. It wasn't of someone sleeping. It was a picture of me, standing by the front door earlier that evening, bag slung over my shoulder. My skin went cold as I stared at it, trying to remember if I had seen a camera anywhere. I hadn't. I was sure of it. I checked the window, looked behind the furniture, even lifted the mattress, searching for any signs of cameras or equipment. There was nothing. The cabin was too old, too bare. But someone had taken that photo. I thought about leaving right then, but it was dark, and the forest was thick. Driving out in the middle of the night seemed risky. I told myself it had to be an old photo. Maybe someone who looked like me had stayed here before. It was a weak explanation, but it helped me crawl into bed and pull the blanket up to my chest. I left the lamp on, even though the weak yellow glow made the photos on the walls seem more present, like they were leaning closer. Sleep came in fits. Every time I closed my eyes, I felt like I was being watched. More than once I thought I heard footsteps outside the window, but when I sat up to listen, there was only the sound of wind in the trees. At some point, exhaustion won out, and I drifted off. When I woke up, it was still dark. The lamp was off, and the room felt colder than before. I sat up slowly, disoriented. Then I saw it. At the foot of the bed was another photo frame propped up on the blanket. My hands shook as I picked it up. It was me asleep, just moments before I woke up. I stood and backed toward the door, gripping the frame tight. I didn't know whether to run or hide. The door creaked loudly as I opened it, and the night air hit me like ice. I stepped outside, glancing around. There were no signs of life. No car, no tracks in the dirt. Nothing to explain how someone had been inside without me hearing. I didn't go back in. I grabbed my bag from the porch and walked to my car, forcing myself not to run. The woods were too quiet, and I kept expecting someone to step out from behind a tree. When I reached the car, I fumbled the keys twice before getting the door open. I drove away without looking back. The headlights cut through the darkness, but I couldn't shake the feeling something was following just beyond their reach. I kept checking the mirror, half expecting to see someone sitting in the back seat. There was no one, but it didn't make me feel better. By the time I hit pavement again, dawn was breaking. I didn't stop until I was back in town. At home, I locked every door and window, then sat in the middle of the living room, breathing hard. It was over, I told myself. I was safe now. Later, when I unpacked, I found something at the bottom of my bag. Another photo. It was of me sitting in my car, driving away from the cabin. In the background, through the rear window, a figure stood on the cabin porch, watching me leave. I don't know how it got there. I don't know who took it. I burned the photo, but I still check the corners of my room every night before I go to sleep. I can't help but feel like there's another picture of me somewhere. Another set of eyes watching from the dark. Story 7. It was late afternoon when I found the old root cellar. I had been hiking through the woods, following no particular trail, just trying to get away for a while. The sun was low, casting long shadows between the trees, when I noticed something odd about the ground ahead of me. There was a patch of earth that looked different, sunken in slightly, with a heavy wooden door sitting flush with the ground. I stepped closer and brushed away some of the dirt and leaves that had gathered over the years. The door had iron hinges, rusted but still solid, and a thick rope handle. Without really thinking, I gave it a tug. It groaned as it lifted, the smell of damp earth and old wood drifting up from the dark space below. A set of narrow steps led down into the cellar. I hesitated for a moment, then turned on the flashlight app on my phone and descended slowly. The air was cold, colder than it should have been for that time of year. My light flickered across stone walls and wooden shelves, and then I saw the boxes. They were lined up neatly, dozens of them, all made of dark, unfinished wood. Each had a simple brass latch and a label on the front. I knelt to look closer. The labels were all the same, last moments followed by a date. The dates stretched back decades. Some were as recent as a year ago. Others went back 30, maybe 40 years. I opened the nearest box. Inside was a single Voss tape. No other markings, just the same label written on the cassette in black marker. I set it back and picked up another. Same thing. Each box held only one tape, carefully placed and untouched by time. I couldn't shake the feeling that I shouldn't be down there, but curiosity pulled me deeper. At the far end of the cellar was an old TV set and a VCR sitting on a metal cart. A thick layer of dust coated everything, but the cords were coiled neatly as if waiting to be used. Against my better judgment, I grabbed one of the tapes at random, one dated 15 years ago, and slid it into the player. The machine whirred to life after a moment of hesitation, the TV flickering on with static before the tape started. The footage was grainy and dim, but it was clear enough to make out a figure on the screen. It was a man, tied to a chair in what looked like the same cellar I was standing in. His mouth was gagged, and his eyes were wide with fear. There was no sound beyond the faint whir of the tape itself, but I could see his chest heaving, see the way he strained against the ropes. For a long time, nothing happened. The man struggled weakly, then stilled. Then, from somewhere off screen, a shadow moved. I couldn't make out who or what it was. The camera never shifted, but whatever was happening beyond the frame made the man tense, his eyes darting wildly. After a few minutes, his body sagged and he stopped moving. The tape ended shortly after. I sat there for a while, feeling sick. I told myself it was fake, that it had to be some kind of elaborate setup, maybe an old art project or an attempt at a horror film. But there was something in the man's eyes, something real. I took the tape out and slid it back into its box, sealing it shut with shaking hands. I should have left then, but instead I stayed. I picked another tape, this one dated more recently. The process was the same, someone tied up, helpless, waiting. But this time there was a woman. She didn't struggle as much as the man had. She just stared at the camera, her expression hollow. And when the shadow came, she didn't move at all. I turned the TV off halfway through. My pulse hammered in my ears as I stood up, my flashlight beam unsteady on the shelves. There were so many boxes, too many. Every one of them marked with a date, a name I hadn't noticed before, written in small letters under the title. The names were all different, all first names, sometimes with initials. I realized they must have been the people in the videos. I backed away toward the stairs, heart pounding. As I turned to go, something caught my eye near the door. Another box, smaller than the others, sat on a shelf by itself. I don't know why I stopped. I opened it without thinking, like my hands were moving on their own. Inside was another tape, but this one didn't have a date. It had my name on it. For a few long seconds, I stared at the label, not fully understanding what I was looking at. My mouth went dry. I dropped the box, the tape clattering to the floor, and I ran up the stairs. The door above was heavy, but I managed to shove it open and scramble out into the fading light. I didn't look back. I sprinted through the woods, branches clawing at my arms, my breath tearing out in panicked gasps. I didn't stop until I reached the road, nearly collapsing when I found my car where I'd parked it earlier. I locked the doors the moment I got inside, hands trembling as I fumbled for the keys. I drove until I hit a gas station on the edge of town. There I sat in the car for what felt like hours, trying to make sense of what I had seen. I kept telling myself it wasn't possible. Someone had to be messing with me, but the fear twisting in my stomach told me otherwise. I never told anyone about the root cellar. I don't go into the woods anymore, not even on familiar trails. But sometimes I dream about that tape. I wonder what's on it. I wonder who filmed it. And I wonder how they knew my name. Story 8. The amusement park had been closed for years, but people still talked about it. They said the owners went bankrupt after a series of accidents, and it had been abandoned ever since. The entrance gates hung crooked on their hinges, the colorful paint long since peeled away. Weeds had overtaken the parking lot, pushing through cracked pavement, and the entire place was unnervingly quiet. I climbed over the rusted turnstiles, my boots crunching over broken glass and gravel. The air smelled faintly of old grease and rust, a mechanical tang that lingered despite the years. As I moved deeper into the park, I half expected to hear laughter or the cheerful music of old rides, but there was nothing. Just the sound of my own breathing and the occasional caw of a bird overhead. The rides were skeletal now, faded remnants of something that had once been bright and inviting. The Ferris wheel loomed against the cloudy sky, its cars swaying slightly in the breeze. Stalls lined the paths, their prizes still hanging in tatters, faded stuffed animals that stared blankly into space. I kept walking, curiosity driving me on even as a knot of unease twisted in my gut. It wasn't long before I heard the sound. A faint hum, rhythmic and mechanical, cutting through the silence like a distant engine. I followed it, picking my way past collapsed fences and rusted railings, and then I found the source. One of the rides was still moving. A spinning attraction called the Whirlwind, its metal arms rotating slowly, the cars swinging out as it turned. There was no power in the park, no reason for anything to be working. And yet the ride spun on, smooth and steady, as if it had never stopped. I stood there for a moment, watching it turn, feeling the hairs on my arms rise. Something about it was wrong. It wasn't just the fact that it was still running, it was how quiet it was. No grinding, no squealing metal, just that constant low hum. I circled around to the control booth, its windows smeared with grime. The door hung slightly open, swaying as I pushed inside. Dust covered everything, except for the control panel. That was clean, the switches flipped, the buttons worn from use. Papers were scattered across the desk, yellowed and curling at the edges, covered in writing that was uneven and shaky. I picked one up and squinted at the faded ink. Testing new restraints, it read, repeated over and over again down the page. The handwriting grew more erratic toward the bottom, the lines slanting sharply. Another note said, "Keep them secure. Mustn't let them leave early." There was a diagram of a restraint harness, more complex than any I'd seen on a carnival ride. Heavy straps, locking mechanisms, bolts that needed keys. I looked back toward the ride. It was still turning, the cars empty except for one. My stomach dropped as I realized it. There was something in one of the seats. From where I stood, I couldn't make it out clearly. It wasn't moving, whatever it was. I stepped out of the booth and made my way toward the ride, my pulse thudding in my ears. The closer I got, the clearer it became. It was a figure strapped into the seat, slumped forward. The restraints were thick, metal bands bolted into the sides of the car, holding the body in place. I stopped a few feet away, my mouth dry. The skin was pale and tight, the hands clenched around the armrests. It looked like it had been there for a long time. The ride didn't slow down. It just kept turning, dragging the figure in endless circles. I stared for a long time, feeling something cold creep over me. This wasn't a leftover from before the park closed. Someone had been here after. Someone had done this recently. I forced myself to back away, glancing again toward the control booth. More notes were tacked to the walls inside. Some were lists of names, others were times and dates. One, scribbled hastily, read, "Next test scheduled tonight." I had no idea what that meant, but I didn't want to stick around to find out. As I turned to leave, I heard a sharp click from behind me. The ride was slowing down. The hum of the motor faded, replaced by the screech of brakes. I froze, watching as the cars came to a gradual stop. The one with the body halted directly in front of me, swaying slightly on its arm. The restraints clicked open, and the figure sagged forward. I stumbled back, nearly tripping over the broken pavement. There was movement in the control booth. A shadow passed across the filthy glass. Someone was in there, watching me. I couldn't see their face, but they were tall, standing perfectly still. The control panel lit up again, the buttons glowing faintly. I didn't wait to see what they would do next. I ran. I cut through the twisted paths, past collapsed booths and crumbling attractions. The entire park seemed to close in around me, the air heavy and thick. I didn't stop until I reached the fence, scrambling over it and landing hard on the other side. I lay there for a moment, gasping for breath, listening for footsteps behind me. There were none. When I finally made it back to my car, I locked the doors and sat there, shaking. The park was still visible in the distance, silent once more. But as I watched, I saw the Ferris wheel slowly start to turn. One car at a time, moving in a lazy circle. There was no wind, no power. I drove away and didn't look back until I was miles down the road. Even then, the thought of that ride, the notes in the booth, and that still figure haunted me. Whatever was happening in that park, it wasn't over. And someone was still testing. Story 9. The old fire tower had been on my list of places to visit for a while. It stood at the peak of a forested hill, half forgotten, its frame rusting but still intact. I had read about it on an abandoned places forum, where people posted photos of eerie locations they had explored. Some mentioned an unsettling feeling they got up there, but no one had described anything more than that. I parked at the edge of the trail and hiked the narrow path winding through dense woods. The forest was quiet, too quiet for a late afternoon. Even the birds seemed to be holding their breath. Every now and then, I glanced back, half expecting to see someone behind me, but the path was always empty. The tower rose above the trees, its silhouette stark against the gray sky. As I approached, I noticed the metal steps groaned under my weight, each footfall echoing sharply in the silence. I climbed steadily, the air growing colder the higher I went. When I reached the top, the door to the observation room was already open. Inside, the room was dusty but otherwise well preserved. A desk stood by the window, its surface scattered with old maps, a pair of cracked binoculars, and a guest logbook. I walked over and brushed some dirt off the cover before flipping it open. The pages were filled with names and dates, some entries decades old. I scanned down the list, noticing that most of the recent names had been crossed out with thick black lines. Beside each crossed out name, in neat handwriting, was the word missing. My eyes moved further down the page until I saw something that made me freeze. My name was there, written in the same handwriting, dated today. My first instinct was to check my phone, but there was no signal. I tried to reason with myself. Maybe someone else with the same name had visited, but the handwriting was too deliberate, too personal. Whoever wrote it knew I was coming, and they had marked me as missing before I had even arrived. I closed the logbook slowly, listening. The tower creaked softly in the breeze. From this height, I should have been able to see far in every direction, but the tree line was blurred by a faint mist that seemed to roll in without warning. It was as if the world beyond the tower was fading. I stepped to the window, scanning the woods below for any movement. There was none. No hikers, no animals, nothing. It felt like I was the only living thing left. Then I noticed something else far down the trail where I had come from. A dark figure stood at the edge of the clearing, completely still. I stared at it, my chest tightening. It didn't move. It didn't seem to be watching me exactly, but it was there, and I hadn't seen it before. I blinked and it was gone. I told myself I had imagined it, but my hands had already started to shake. I backed away from the window and turned toward the door. It was still open, but the steps outside now seemed impossibly narrow and dangerous. I had climbed them easily before, but now I wasn't sure I could make it down without looking over my shoulder every second. I took a deep breath and forced myself to move. As I started down, the wind picked up, whistling through the structure in a high, almost human sound. Halfway to the ground, I stopped, heart pounding. Something was below me. Another figure standing at the base of the tower, head tilted up toward me. I couldn't make out any details, just the dark outline against the pale ground. I kept going, feet faster than I meant them to be, hands gripping the rails so tightly they hurt. When I reached the ground, there was nothing there. The figure was gone again, but the air felt charged, like something unseen was circling me. I told myself to move, to get back to the car and leave. The trail seemed longer than before. I walked quickly, almost jogging, but the woods around me felt closer, the trees denser. The silence wasn't just a lack of sound anymore, it felt like something waiting. I glanced back and for just a second, thought I saw more figures moving between the trunks, matching my pace. When I finally reached the parking lot, my car was still there. I unlocked it with shaking hands, slid inside, and slammed the door. As I started the engine, I caught a glimpse of something in the rearview mirror. A figure standing at the edge of the lot, exactly where the trail began. I didn't look back again. I drove straight home, my mind running through what had happened. The guest log with my name, the word missing beside it, the dark figures watching me. None of it made sense. I told myself I was just shaken, that it had all been some strange coincidence, a trick of the light, my mind playing games in an eerie place. But that night, as I was getting ready for bed, I noticed something on my desk. The guest logbook from the tower was there. I hadn't brought it with me. I hadn't touched it after closing it. Yet there it sat, dusty and heavy, exactly as it had been at the top of the fire tower. I opened it slowly. My name was still there, but the word missing was no longer beside it. Instead, it now said returned. Below that, in handwriting I didn't recognize, was the word for now. I closed the book and shoved it into a drawer. Since that day, I've felt eyes on me whenever I leave the house. Sometimes I wake up in the middle of the night, sure that someone is standing just outside my bedroom door. I haven't gone back to the tower, and I never will. But I know that one day, my name will be crossed out again. And next time, I don't think I'll be coming back. Story 10. I had been driving for hours along a stretch of highway that seemed to go on forever. The sun was setting fast, and I was too tired to keep going. When I saw the flickering neon sign for an old roadside motel, I pulled off without thinking twice. It didn't look like much, but I wasn't in the mood to be picky. The parking lot was empty, except for an old truck parked near the end. I stepped into the office, and an older man behind the counter barely glanced up as I walked in. He slid a key across the desk without asking my name or offering any pleasantries. The number on the tag was 6, and the man told me the room was down on the left. The hallway smelled damp, and the lights overhead buzzed faintly. My footsteps echoed as I carried my bag toward the room. I unlocked the door, and it swung open with a soft groan. The room was simple: a bed, a small dresser, and a chair by the window. It wasn't much, but it was quiet. As I set my bag down, I noticed something strange about the door. There was a peephole in it, but it wasn't facing outward like you'd expect. It was pointing into the room. I stared at it for a few seconds, then walked up to it and pressed my eye to the glass. All I saw was the empty hallway behind the door. Something about it unsettled me, but I shrugged it off and sat on the bed. The springs creaked loudly beneath me. I tried to tell myself it was fine. Old motels like this had quirks. Still, the feeling that I was being watched lingered at the back of my mind. I got up to pull the curtains shut and noticed the chair by the window. It was positioned in such a way that it faced the door directly, almost like someone had been sitting there, just watching it. The back legs were scuffed and worn, as if it had been dragged into place over and over. After a while, I decided I wasn't going to sleep unless I figured out why I felt so on edge. I grabbed my flashlight and stepped outside into the cool night air. The hallway was still empty, the buzzing light casting long shadows along the floor. I glanced around, then moved toward the room next door, room 7. The door was cracked open slightly, and I pushed it the rest of the way. The room was dark and colder than mine, as if the air hadn't moved in years. My flashlight beam swept across the floor, catching on something that made me stop. A chair sat in the middle of the room, facing one of the walls. I stepped closer, noticing how the chair was bolted to the floor. I ran my hand along the back of it, and the wood felt rough under my fingers. As I circled around to the front, I saw the wall it faced had a series of holes drilled into it. They were small, but large enough to see through if someone wanted to watch what was happening on the other side. I crouched down and peered through one of the holes. On the other side was my room. The view was perfect, clear enough to see the bed, the chair by the window, even the door. The peephole I'd noticed earlier must have been part of it, some strange two-way observation point. My stomach twisted as I realized someone could have been sitting in this chair, watching guests in room 6 without them ever knowing. I stood up quickly, backing away from the wall. There were scratch marks on the floor beneath the chair, as though someone had struggled there. The arms of the chair were dark and stained with something I didn't want to think about too hard. I turned toward the door, ready to leave, but something caught my attention on the dresser. There was a notebook lying open. Its pages were filled with handwriting dates, room numbers, and what looked like descriptions of people. Some pages had sketches of faces, detailed enough to make me feel sick. One of the entries mentioned room 6. The description matched me. The date was today. I slammed the notebook shut and rushed out of room 7, my heart racing. The hallway felt different now, too quiet, too still. When I reached my room, I hesitated at the door. I didn't want to go back inside, but I needed my things. I opened the door slowly and stepped in. The chair by the window had been moved. It was now turned toward the bed. I was sure I hadn't left it like that. My bag was still on the dresser, but it had been unzipped. I hadn't left it that way either. Someone had been in there while I was next door. I grabbed my bag and slung it over my shoulder, ignoring the way my hands shook. As I headed back toward the door, I heard a faint sound. Breathing, slow and steady. It was coming from behind the bathroom door. I didn't wait to check. I yanked the door open and ran back into the hallway. I didn't stop to think about where I was going. I just ran. Past room 7, past the office toward the parking lot. When I reached my car, I fumbled with the keys, dropping them once before managing to unlock the door. I jumped inside, locked the doors, and started the engine. As I drove away, I glanced back once in the rearview mirror. The old man from the front desk stood in the doorway of the office, watching me go. He didn't move. He didn't wave. He just stared, his face expressionless in the flickering light. I drove for miles before stopping at a gas station to catch my breath. I checked the backseat twice before I finally calmed down enough to think clearly. I would never go back to that motel. I wasn't even sure I'd sleep again for a while. But even now, I can't shake the feeling that someone is still watching me. Sometimes at night, I hear breathing I can't explain. Sometimes I feel like there's a hole in my wall that I just haven't found yet. Story 11. The old veterinary clinic sat on the edge of town, where the streetlights ended and the forest took over. It had been closed for years, ever since the last owner vanished without a word. People said you could still hear barking late at night if you walked past, but I figured it was just coyotes. I'd driven by it enough times to know it wasn't much to look at, just a low building with peeling paint and boarded windows. Curiosity eventually got the better of me. One late afternoon, I parked a little ways up the road and made my way toward the back entrance. The door was unlocked, but it stuck like it hadn't moved in a while. With a hard shove, it creaked open, revealing a narrow hallway lined with old cabinets and faded posters of smiling dogs and cats. The air inside was stale, thick with the smell of mildew and something sharper beneath it. I moved slowly through the building, my flashlight cutting through the gloom. Exam rooms stood empty, their counters cluttered with dusty jars and scattered papers. An overturned stool lay in the middle of the hall, its legs splayed awkwardly. In one of the rooms, I found a rusted examination table, its surface stained and scratched as though something had fought hard not to stay on it. The deeper I went, the colder it seemed to get. I found myself standing in front of a heavy metal door with a frost-lined handle. It was the walk-in freezer. The latch resisted at first, but then gave way with a screech that set my teeth on edge. A wave of cold air rolled out, fogging my breath as I stepped inside. Rows of metal shelves lined the walls, most of them empty. At first I thought there was nothing there, but then my light caught a pile of small metal tags in a crate by the far wall. I moved closer and saw they were collar tags, hundreds of them, each stamped with names. Some were common: Max, Buddy, Daisy, but others were stranger, like numbers or Red Boy. They looked recently polished, not corroded like everything else in the place. Next to the tags was an old clipboard, the paper yellowed but the writing still clear. It listed dates and descriptions, weights, breeds, colors, but no mention of owners. Some of the names matched the tags in the box. A few had a red check mark beside them. I ran my gloved fingers through the pile, noting how cold the metal felt even through the fabric. In the corner of the freezer was something else. A large cardboard box sealed with duct tape, the top sagging in from dampness. It wasn't labeled like the tags were, just a single name scrawled in black marker: John Doe. My chest tightened as I crouched beside it. Something told me to leave it alone, but my hand was already pulling at the tape, peeling it back in slow, deliberate strips. Inside were bones, clean white and arranged in neat layers like someone had taken care to fit them together just so. A human skull rested on top, its empty socket staring upward. It was labeled with a small plastic tag looped around the jawbone: John Doe. I stared at it for a long moment, then shut the box and stood up too fast, nearly knocking into one of the shelves. The freezer felt smaller now. The cold air bit into my skin through my jacket, and I realized I was holding my breath. I backed out slowly, keeping the box in sight until the door was between me and it. I let it fall shut and turned the latch until it clicked into place. My fingers trembled as I wiped them on my jeans. I wasn't ready to leave just yet. Something pushed me to keep looking, maybe to understand what kind of place this had become. I followed the hall to what must have been the office. Papers littered the floor, some shredded as if by claws or teeth. A filing cabinet stood half open, its drawers full of old records. Mixed in with the patient files were photos, some of pets, others of people. None of them smiled. On the desk was a dusty laptop, its cracked screen frozen on a spreadsheet. I wiped it with my sleeve and leaned in to read. Rows of numbers and names, ages, weights. Some entries had notes beside them: non-compliant, aggressive, excellent condition. I scrolled down and found recent dates, much newer than the clinic's supposed closing. Someone had been here long after it was abandoned. I heard something fall in another room. A soft thud followed by a faint scraping sound. My pulse quickened as I switched off the flashlight and stood perfectly still. The sound came again, closer this time, like something dragging along the floor. I stepped back into the hall, keeping low, and peered around the corner toward the source of the noise. Nothing moved in the gloom, but the sound kept coming, steady and slow. I forced myself to move, heading in the opposite direction toward the front entrance. Each footstep felt too loud, each breath too harsh. I passed the waiting room, where cracked chairs sat in a row beneath faded posters of happy families with their pets. The front door was still chained shut from the inside. I unhooked it as quietly as I could, slipped through the gap, and pulled it closed behind me. The sound stopped as soon as I stepped outside. The quiet that followed felt wrong, too empty even for this place. I didn't look back. I just walked to my car and drove away without glancing at the rearview mirror. Back home, I tried to make sense of what I'd found. The tags, the bones, the files, they didn't add up to anything I wanted to understand. The worst part was knowing someone had kept going long after everyone thought the place was closed. Maybe they still were. Maybe they were still collecting. Sometimes at night, I think about the box labeled John Doe and wonder if there are others. If each tag in that freezer once belonged to more than just a dog or cat, and if someone's still keeping records, adding new names to their files even now. Story 12. The miner's cabin was deeper in the woods than I expected. It took me the better part of the day to reach it, following old trails that were nearly swallowed up by brush and roots. The air was thick with pine and damp earth, and every few steps I thought I heard something moving just out of sight. By the time I arrived, the sky was already dimming with the onset of evening. The place looked untouched, like it had been waiting there all these years. Its roof sagged in places but still held firm, and the single window was clouded with grime. I stepped onto the creaking porch and pushed open the door. The inside smelled of old wood smoke, dust, and something faintly metallic. There wasn't much inside. A rusted stove sat in one corner next to a pile of firewood long since rotted through. A small table stood by the window, one leg braced with a piece of stone. There was a narrow bed against the far wall, its mattress flattened and stained from years of neglect. It didn't look comfortable, but I wasn't in a position to be picky. I dropped my pack near the door and took a walk through the cabin, shining my flashlight into corners. The boards creaked under my boots with each step. Mice had nested in some of the lower cabinets, but otherwise it was empty. It almost felt like whoever had lived there had simply walked away one day. When I finally settled down on the bed, I noticed the marks on the bedpost. They looked like scratches at first, worn shallow by time. But when I leaned closer, I realized they formed words. The message was uneven and jagged, carved by a hand that had either been in a hurry or trembling. If you're reading this, it's already too late. I ran my fingers over the letters, trying to decide if it was meant as a joke. But the more I stared, the colder I felt. Something about the depth of those cuts, the way they dug into the grain, made me uneasy. It wasn't just a passing message, it was a warning. I tried to laugh it off, telling myself people get bored in remote places and carve things to pass the time. But the wind outside shifted, rattling the shutters in a way that sounded like fingernails scraping against wood. I shook it off and turned back to unpacking my things. Night settled quickly in those woods. I lit an old oil lantern I had brought, placing it on the table. The light flickered and stretched shadows across the walls. I made a small fire in the stove to take the edge off the cold. The warmth helped, but it didn't push away the feeling that I wasn't alone. I sat on the edge of the bed, staring at the words on the post again. I kept thinking about who wrote it and what happened to them. I kept glancing at the window, expecting to see something staring back at me. But there was nothing, just dark shapes of trees swaying against the night sky. The first noise came from the roof, a slow, deliberate scraping, like something was being dragged across the shingles. I froze, listening. It moved from one side of the cabin to the other, then stopped. A few moments later, I heard a faint thud near the back wall. I told myself it was probably a raccoon or something similar, though I didn't really believe it. I got up, grabbed my flashlight, and opened the back door. The beam cut through the darkness, showing nothing but empty forest and undergrowth. No sign of animals, no tracks in the dirt. When I went back inside, the message on the bedpost caught my eye again. I swore the letters looked deeper than before, like they'd been carved again while I was out. I ran my fingers across them, and they came away damp with something dark. It wasn't dust. It was fresher than that. The wind picked up again, and something slammed hard against the window. I jumped and turned quickly, the lantern flickering as the draft slipped inside. Outside, the forest was silent, too silent. No insects, no owls, nothing. Just a heavy stillness that made my skin crawl. I bolted the door and sat with my back against the wall, gripping my flashlight tightly. Hours passed, or maybe it was just minutes. Time felt strange in that place. I kept hearing faint tapping sounds, first on the walls, then closer, as if they were coming from inside the room. The stove's fire was dying, but I didn't dare move to feed it. The cabin was dark, except for the weak glow of the lantern, and its light was shrinking, casting longer shadows that seemed to shift when I wasn't looking. I pressed my hand over my mouth to keep my breathing quiet. Then I heard the whisper, soft at first, right next to my ear, like someone crouched beside me. It said my name slowly, drawing out the syllables in a voice that didn't belong to anyone I knew. I shot up, shining the flashlight around the room, but there was nothing there. Just empty space and shadows. I decided to leave. I stuffed everything back into my pack, hands shaking so badly I could barely manage the buckles. I unbolted the door and stepped out into the freezing night air. I didn't look back at the cabin. I just walked. Fast at first, then running when I thought I heard footsteps behind me. The trail back was harder to find in the dark. I stumbled more than once, branches clawing at my face and arms. But I kept moving. I didn't care where I ended up as long as it was far from that place. After what felt like hours, I finally reached my truck. I drove until dawn, not stopping until I hit the edge of town. When I finally looked in the rearview mirror, I thought I saw something sitting in the bed of the truck. A shadow darker than the night, crouched low and waiting. But when I stopped to check, there was nothing there. I never went back to that cabin. But sometimes, even now, I wake up and find scratches on the walls near my bed. They're the same jagged letters, always forming the same message. If you're reading this, it's already too late. Story 13. I had always been drawn to places left behind. There was something about the silence of abandoned buildings that made me feel like I was standing in a forgotten story. One afternoon, I drove past an old post office on the outskirts of town. The windows were boarded up, the paint peeling away in long strips, and a faded sign still hung above the door, swaying slightly in the breeze. I parked my car a little ways down the road and walked back, the gravel crunching beneath my boots. The front door was locked, but a broken window on the side gave me easy access. I slid through carefully, landing with a soft thud on the dusty floor inside. The air was thick with mildew and something faintly metallic, the smell making me hesitate for a moment before moving forward. The lobby was dim, lit only by the slivers of daylight creeping through gaps in the boards. The counter where people would have once mailed letters was still there, though cracked and warped with time. Dust hung in the air, disturbed by my movements as I walked slowly toward the rows of mail slots lining the far wall. Each one was filled to overflowing. I stepped closer and realized they weren't stuffed with old letters like I expected. Instead, each slot was crammed with missing persons flyers. Some were yellowed and brittle, while others looked newer, their ink still sharp and dark. The faces stared back at me, men, women, even children. Every one of them had missing printed in large, bold letters above their names. I ran my fingers lightly over the edge of one, feeling how fragile it was. The dates on the flyers spanned decades, some from as far back as the 1970s. Others were recent, only a year or two old. It didn't make sense. Who would bring them here, and why? I couldn't imagine anyone had sorted through these in years, yet there they were, filling every slot as if they were meant to be found. Something about it made me uneasy, but I told myself it was just the strangeness of the place. I moved away from the wall and stepped behind the counter, my boots leaving faint prints in the thick dust. There was a door at the back of the room, slightly ajar. I hesitated only a second before pushing it open the rest of the way. The back room was darker than the front, and it took a moment for my eyes to adjust. Shelves lined the walls, most of them empty, except for a few scattered parcels that looked long forgotten. But it wasn't the shelves that caught my attention. It was the wall opposite the door, covered from floor to ceiling with driver's licenses. They were pinned up in careful rows, each one spaced neatly from the next. Some were old and faded, the photos washed out, while others looked like they could have been issued just weeks ago. My breath caught in my throat as I stepped closer, reading the names. A chill ran down my spine when I realized many of them matched the missing persons flyers I had seen out front. I stood there for what felt like a long time, just staring. There had to be hundreds of licenses. Some still had wallet creases, while others had ragged edges as if they'd been torn out by force. I reached out and touched one lightly, feeling the worn plastic, the photo of a smiling man looking back at me as if he were still alive. The dates on the licenses stretched back years, maybe decades. I saw different states, even different countries. It was like someone had been collecting them for longer than I'd been alive. My stomach twisted as the thought settled in. This wasn't random. Someone had put them here with care. Someone had taken them from the people who had vanished. I turned away quickly, needing to put distance between myself and the wall. My flashlight's beam swept over the rest of the room, landing on something else in the corner. The small desk sat there, covered in papers. I walked over, picking up a few of the sheets. They were lists. Names, dates, times, even addresses. Some of the names matched what I had seen on the flyers and licenses. There were notes scrawled in the margins, little details that made my skin crawl. Last seen at gas station, one said. Another read follows routine, easy target. I dropped the papers back onto the desk as a sudden wave of nausea hit me. Whoever had been here had been watching these people, tracking them. I backed away from the desk and turned toward the door, ready to leave. But just as I stepped forward, something on the floor caught my foot. I looked down and saw a trapdoor, its edges outlined in dust. Without thinking, I knelt and brushed it clear, finding a small iron ring as a handle. My heart pounded, but I couldn't stop myself from lifting it open. The space below was pitch black. I aimed my flashlight down into the opening and saw stairs leading into the darkness. A faint smell rose from the hole, something damp and rotten. I stood there, debating whether to climb down, but something told me I shouldn't. I closed the trapdoor slowly, the hinges creaking as it settled back into place. I backed out of the room, my pulse racing. Every instinct screamed to get out of there. I hurried through the front, past the staring faces on the flyers, and climbed out the window. Once I was outside, I didn't stop. I ran to my car, climbed in, and locked the doors, my hands shaking as I fumbled with the keys. As I drove away, I glanced back at the post office. It stood silent, empty as it had been for years. But I couldn't shake the feeling that someone, somewhere inside, was still watching me. And when I closed my eyes that night, all I could see were the names carved in lists and the faces of the people who had never made it home. Story 14. The farmhouse was further out than I expected, sitting at the end of a dirt road that wound between empty fields. It looked like no one had lived there in years, maybe longer. The roof sagged slightly, and most of the windows were either boarded up or missing their glass entirely. The front door stood half open, swaying gently in the breeze like it had been waiting for someone to step inside. I parked a little ways back and walked the rest of the distance, the gravel crunching under my boots the only sound. Up close, the house seemed even more tired, its paint stripped away by time and weather. The wooden porch groaned when I stepped onto it, but it held. For a moment, I hesitated at the doorway, peering into the dim interior where dust hung thick in the air. Inside, it smelled of damp wood and old dirt. The floor was warped in places, but solid enough to cross without worry. I moved carefully, noting the way the house felt strangely still, as if holding its breath. The front room was empty except for a broken chair and a length of rope coiled neatly on the floorboards. I made my way toward the kitchen, where the light was a little better. What I saw there made me stop cold. Every inch of wall space was covered with Polaroid photos, lined up neatly in rows. There were hundreds of them, maybe more, each pinned carefully in place like some kind of gallery. I stepped closer and realized they were all of people. Each photo showed someone different, always standing in the same spot just outside the farmhouse door. Some were smiling awkwardly, others stared blankly ahead. The backgrounds were different too: daytime, night, rain, sun, but always the same doorway, always the same house. At the bottom of every picture was a date and a time written in neat black ink. The handwriting was steady, consistent. The dates stretched back years. Some photos were yellowed with age, others still had the glossy sheen of newer prints. Whoever had taken these had been doing it for a long time. I studied the faces in the pictures. None of them looked familiar, but there was something about their expressions that unsettled me. A few had a kind of forced smile, like they hadn't wanted to be in the photo but didn't have a choice. Others looked genuinely confused, as if they didn't know why they were standing there at all. The most recent photo hung near the doorway leading out of the kitchen. It was of a man in a dark jacket, hands jammed deep into his pockets. He wasn't smiling. His eyes were fixed on the camera, his face pale and drawn. The date under it was just a week ago. I turned away from the photos and walked around the kitchen. There was an old table against one wall, its surface scarred with deep scratches. On it sat a Polaroid camera, still in good condition. Next to it was a small notebook, its cover stained and worn. I flipped through it, finding lists of dates and names, but no explanations. I moved to the window and looked outside. The front yard was empty. No cars, no signs of recent visitors. Yet someone had been here, and recently, judging by the last photo. I thought about leaving, but something kept me rooted in place. A need to understand what this all meant. I went back to the photos and tried to pick out a pattern. Some of the people were dressed for cold weather, others for warm. The times written under them varied. There didn't seem to be a connection, at least not one I could see. But they were all here, recorded like entries in some obsessive catalog. After a while, I noticed something else. In some of the older photos, you could just make out a figure in the background inside the house. A shadow near the window, a pale blur behind the door's edge. I looked closer and realized it wasn't always the same figure. Sometimes it was tall, sometimes small, but it was always there. I shivered, suddenly aware of how quiet the house had become again. I backed away from the wall, careful not to bump any of the photos. My foot hit something on the floor, and I glanced down to see another stack of pictures lying loose near the baseboard. I picked them up, flipping through them slowly. These were different. The people in them were seated at the kitchen table or standing inside the house. Their expressions had changed. Most of them looked terrified, some were crying, and one or two were slumped over as if unconscious. The dates were more recent, and the last one in the pile was marked with today's date. I dropped the photos and backed away, my pulse thudding in my ears. Something was wrong here, something far beyond what I'd expected to find. I turned to leave, moving quickly toward the front door. As I passed the window, I caught movement outside, a figure stepping into view at the far edge of the yard. I froze, watching as the figure moved closer. It was a man, but I couldn't make out his features. He was walking steadily, like he knew exactly where he was going. Toward the house. Toward me. I turned and hurried through the front door, not bothering to close it behind me. I made it to my car and fumbled with the keys before getting the door open. As I climbed in and slammed it shut, I glanced back toward the house. The figure was standing in the doorway now, watching me. I couldn't tell if he was holding something, but his hands were raised slightly, as if ready to lift a camera. I started the engine and drove away, not slowing down until I was miles from the farmhouse. Even then, I kept checking the rearview mirror, half expecting to see someone following. I never went back, but the images stuck with me. Sometimes when I'm alone at night, I think I hear the faint sound of a camera shutter, and I wonder if somewhere there's another Polaroid pinned to that kitchen wall. One with my face on it, standing in the doorway, with the date and time written carefully underneath. Story 15. The hotel had been abandoned for decades. Its windows were broken, the front doors hanging off rusted hinges. Vines had crept up the walls, winding their way inside through every crack they could find. I had driven past it countless times, but that day something made me stop. I slipped through a gap where the lobby doors once stood. The smell inside was thick with mildew and dust, each breath heavy in my lungs. The old carpet squished beneath my boots, damp and rotting away. It was silent except for the distant groan of the building settling around me. The lobby was stripped bare. A few broken chairs lay scattered, and the reception desk was coated in dust and grime. Where there had once been large mirrors behind the counter, there were only jagged shards left in the frames. Most of them had fallen to the floor, glittering like broken ice. I walked deeper into the building. Each hallway was darker than the last, the wallpaper peeling away in long strips. Doors hung open or lay flat on the floor. Some rooms still had beds, the mattresses sunken in the middle, stained and shredded by animals or worse. What struck me most was the mirrors. Every room had one, usually above a dresser or on the back of a door, but all of them were broken spiderweb cracks or shattered completely. Some frames were empty, glass shards scattered like teeth across the carpet. I kept moving, curiosity stronger than good sense. The higher floors were worse. The stairwell groaned with every step, the banister loose under my grip. By the time I reached the 4th floor, it was clear the building wasn't safe. But I had seen something in the lobby that kept me going. There had been a map behind the reception desk. Room 409 had been circled in red marker. Someone had written "Do not enter" beneath it. I figured it was as good a destination as any. The door to 409 was closed. Unlike the others, it wasn't hanging by its hinges or smashed in. It was intact, though marked by deep scratches, as if someone had clawed at it from both sides. I tried the handle, expecting it to be stuck, but it turned easily. Inside, the room was almost empty. The bed frame was bare, the mattress gone. A single chair sat in the corner. The wallpaper here wasn't peeled or torn. It was cleaner than the rest of the hotel, though I could still smell mold and damp wood. But the strangest thing was the mirror. It was the only one I had found that wasn't broken. It hung above a dresser that looked untouched by time. The glass was flawless, clean, without a single crack. I stepped closer, already feeling the hairs on my arms rise. When I looked into it, I didn't see my reflection. The room staring back at me was different. It had a bed with crisp white sheets, a dresser with a vase of flowers, and sunlight streaming through lace curtains. It was warm and inviting, the opposite of where I stood. I stared at the glass, not sure if I was imagining it. I moved to the side, but the view didn't shift the way it should. It was like looking through a window, not a mirror. There was no reflection, just another room that shouldn't exist. Something moved in the room on the other side. A figure stepped into view, its back to me. It looked like a man, tall and thin, dressed in dark clothes. He moved slowly, his head tilting as if listening for something. Then he turned. I stumbled back from the dresser. His face was pale, too pale, the skin stretched tight over bone. His eyes were black, wide and empty, but he was staring directly at me, as if he could see through the glass. His lips moved slowly, forming words I couldn't hear. I wanted to run, but I was frozen. His hand pressed against the glass from his side, pale fingers splayed wide. Then the glass rippled, like water in a still pond disturbed by a stone. His fingers pushed through, breaking the surface between his world and mine. I snapped out of it and bolted for the door. My feet thudded hard against the floorboards as I ran, not daring to look back. I heard something move behind me, something dragging along the walls. It sounded wet, slick, as if something heavy was being hauled through the hole. I made it to the stairwell and jumped down 3 steps at a time. The banister cracked under my hand, but I didn't stop. My chest was tight, lungs burning, the air colder the lower I went. I could still hear the dragging sound following me. When I reached the lobby, I didn't look for the exit, I ran straight for it. The daylight outside nearly blinded me as I burst through the open doorway. I didn't stop running until I was back at my car, slamming the door shut and locking it. I sat there for a long time, catching my breath. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely hold the keys. When I finally looked back at the hotel, it was silent again. No sign of movement, no sound. It looked as empty as it had before I went inside. But in the upstairs window, I saw a flicker of movement. Just a shadow, standing still behind the glass, watching. I started the car and left, not looking back again. That night, I dreamed of the mirror. I dreamed of the room behind the glass, how warm and bright it had seemed at first. And I dreamed of the man with black eyes, standing on the other side, waiting. His hand pressed against the surface, waiting for me to get closer again. Story 16. The train yard had been abandoned for decades. I had heard about it from an old coworker who said it was a relic from another era, a place where time had frozen. On a cold afternoon, curiosity got the better of me, and I decided to check it out. The tracks were twisted and rusted, swallowed by weeds, and the carriages stood in silence, weathered by time and neglect. I climbed over a broken fence to get inside. The air was thick with the scent of old metal and damp wood. Every step I took echoed through the empty space, disturbing birds that flew off with sudden flurries of wings. I passed one carriage after another, their doors hanging open, revealing torn seats and broken windows. One particular carriage caught my attention. It was different from the others, heavier somehow, with thick iron bars across the windows. The door was closed, but the latch was broken. I gripped the handle and slid it open, wincing at the screech of metal on metal. Inside, the air was cooler, stale but less moldy than I expected. The first thing I noticed was the chains. Thick iron links bolted straight into the floor at regular intervals, each ending in heavy cuffs that lay open and empty. They looked too strong to be meant for luggage or freight. These had been made to hold something, or someone in place. The walls were covered in scratches. At first I thought they were just the random damage of time and decay. But as my eyes adjusted, I realized they were words carved deep into the wood and metal. Some were rough, as if made in desperation, while others were etched with slow, careful precision. "Feed us." The words repeated over and over again, sometimes large and angry, sometimes small and almost pleading. But they don't stop appeared just as often. There were other phrases too, less clear, sometimes just names or dates. In places, the scratches overlapped until the wood was gouged and splintered beyond recognition. I ran my fingers lightly over one section, the letters sharp and deep. They hadn't faded with time. Some of them looked disturbingly fresh. The thought made me step back quickly, my boot clanging against the metal floor. I glanced around, suddenly aware of how quiet it was in there. No birds, no breeze. Just stillness. My own breathing sounded too loud. I told myself it was just the atmosphere getting to me. That's all it was. But I didn't quite believe it. At the far end of the carriage, there was another door. This one was locked with a thick chain and padlock. It seemed newer than everything else, the metal still shiny. I crouched down and inspected it, wondering who had put it there and why. It hadn't been left to rust like the rest of the place. Something about the door made me uneasy. I stood there for a while, debating whether I should try to force it open. Part of me wanted to know what was inside. The other part wanted to get back to my car and leave the yard behind. In the end, I took a few steps back and decided not to push my luck. As I turned to leave, I noticed deep marks on the floor, trailing from the door toward the chains. Scratches like something heavy had been dragged. There were old stains too, dark and rusty, following the same path. My stomach twisted as I realized what it probably was. I hurried toward the exit, but something caught my eye. Near one of the windows, there was a pile of something small and pale. At first, I thought they were pieces of broken wood or bone. But as I got closer, I saw they were fingernails. Dozens of them, some old and yellowed, others newer. I stumbled back, almost tripping over one of the chains. My breath came hard now, and my hand shook as I reached for the door handle. As I pulled it open, I thought I heard something shift behind me. Just the sound of metal sliding over metal, faint but unmistakable. I didn't turn around. I couldn't. I stepped out into the daylight, my heart hammering in my chest. The air outside felt thin and cold. I slammed the door shut behind me, though I knew it wouldn't do much good. I walked fast, not daring to run but wanting to put distance between me and that carriage. The other cars seemed to watch me as I passed, their windows dark and empty, their doors gaping like mouths. I kept my eyes on the ground and didn't stop until I reached the fence. When I got back to my car, I sat behind the wheel for a long time before I could start the engine. I kept glancing at the entrance to the yard, half expecting someone or something to come walking out after me. Nothing did, but it didn't make me feel any better. That night, I couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw those words scratched into the walls. Feed us. Don't stop. I heard the scrape of chains in my mind, felt the cold metal cuffs on my wrists. I kept the lights on and the windows locked. Over the next few days, I tried to forget what I'd seen, but the images stuck with me, replaying over and over again. I started searching online for anything about the old train yard. There wasn't much, just a few mentions of it closing down in the 70s. No reason given. Then I found a single article from decades ago, a short piece about a missing persons case. Several people had vanished around that time. The last line mentioned rumors about the yard, but it was vague. No details, just speculation. I haven't gone back. I don't think I ever will. But sometimes I still hear the sound of chains in the middle of the night. And once, when I woke up from a restless sleep, I found words scratched into the wall above my bed. They were the same ones I had seen in that carriage. Feed us, don't stop. Story 17. The hike had taken longer than I planned. The sun was dipping behind the tree line, and I realized I wasn't going to make it back before dark. I didn't want to risk stumbling through unfamiliar terrain with only the weak beam of my flashlight, so when I found the cabin, I thought it was luck. It was set back from the trail, half hidden by undergrowth, as if the forest had been trying to reclaim it. I approached slowly, testing each step on the creaking wooden porch. The door hung slightly open, the hinges whining as I pushed it inward. Inside was dark but dry, and that was enough for me. A single room stretched out before me, with an old cot in one corner and a heavy wooden table in the other. Dust coated everything, but it didn't smell rotten. I figured I'd just rest here for the night and move on at first light. After setting my pack down, I checked the door to make sure it could shut. That's when I saw the claw marks. Long, deep gouges raked across the inside of the door, as if something had tried to get out rather than in. The wood was splintered and raw, and when I ran my fingers over it, the cuts were deeper than I expected. It wasn't from a knife or tool. It looked like it had been done by hand or something close to it. I tried to tell myself it was an old hunter's shack. Maybe bears had gotten in once, and someone tried to claw their way out in panic. That was believable, I thought. I just needed a safe place to sleep. I wedged a chair under the handle to feel a little more secure and tried not to think about it. On the table I found a small leather-bound book. It was worn and stained, the edges curled and soft from years of handling. Curious, I opened it. The handwriting was neat at first, recording the weather, some dates and short notes about hunting trips. As I flipped further in, the entries grew strange. The writer mentioned hearing noises at night, scratching sounds from under the floor, whispering voices he couldn't quite understand. The tone shifted from calm to desperate, and the last few pages were little more than frantic scrawls. On the final page, in handwriting that shook so badly it was hard to read, were the words, "I hear them outside." I set the book down slowly, my heart thudding in my chest. The room was silent, except for the faint sigh of wind through the cracks in the walls. I told myself it was just an old diary from someone who'd been out here too long, isolated and half mad. Still, I found myself listening harder, straining to hear something beyond the wind. I rolled out my sleeping bag on the cot, but I didn't sleep. Every creak of the old cabin made me sit up, holding my breath. I kept thinking about those claw marks, how deep they were, and how desperate the person must have been to leave them behind. Around midnight, I finally dozed off, but it wasn't peaceful. A sound woke me. I wasn't sure how long I'd been asleep. I opened my eyes and it was still dark, though I couldn't tell if it was night or early morning. At first, I thought I'd imagined it, but then I heard it again, something moving outside. It was a soft scraping, like nails on wood, followed by a faint thump. Then another, closer this time. I sat up slowly, careful not to make noise. My heart was pounding so hard it hurt. I reached for my flashlight, turning it on and aiming the beam toward the door. Nothing. Just the claw marks and the chair wedged under the handle. But the sounds outside kept going. They circled the cabin, slow and steady, as if something was pacing just beyond the walls. I wanted to believe it was an animal. A raccoon maybe, or a bear. But it didn't sound like any animal I'd heard before. The scraping was too deliberate, the thumping too rhythmic. I sat there frozen, flashlight shaking in my hand, until the sound stopped completely. For a moment, there was nothing but silence so thick it roared in my ears. Then came the knock. A slow, deliberate knock right at the door. 3 times, evenly spaced. I didn't move. I didn't breathe. I stared at the door, half expecting it to burst open, but it didn't. Instead, something pressed against it from the outside. The wood bowed inward, just slightly, as if something heavy was leaning on it. I couldn't stay there. I grabbed my bag, leaving most of my gear behind, and backed toward the window. It was old, the glass wavy and streaked with grime, but I managed to slide it open quietly. I crawled out into the cold night air, careful not to make a sound. Once I was outside, I crouched low and listened. The knocking had stopped, but I could still feel something watching me. I didn't look back. I ran as quietly as I could, sticking close to the trees for cover. The trail was hard to find in the dark, but I didn't care. I just wanted to get away from that place. After what felt like hours, the sky began to lighten. I finally found the trail again and forced myself to keep moving, even though my legs were shaking and my lungs burned. When I made it back to the parking area, there were no other cars. I got in mine and drove without stopping until I was back in town. I didn't tell anyone what had happened. I didn't want to explain the claw marks, the diary, or the thing that had knocked on the door. People would think I imagined it, that I was overtired or spooked by being alone in the woods. But sometimes at night, I still hear the sound in my head. The slow scrape of something sharp on wood. The knock that followed, steady and patient. I can't sleep near windows anymore. And I'll never stay in a cabin I find on a trail again. Story 18. The old police station had been abandoned for more than 2 decades. I found it on the outskirts of town, past the derelict shops and empty homes that no one seemed to claim anymore. The windows were mostly broken, and the front door hung crooked on its hinges, swaying slightly every time the wind picked up. I stepped inside, flashlight in hand, the beam cutting through years of dust that hung thick in the air. The main lobby was frozen in time. A few cracked chairs sat along the wall beneath faded posters about safety and community programs. The reception desk was covered in a thick film of grime, papers scattered, as if whoever had been working there had left in a hurry. I moved slowly, boots scraping on the tile, leaving marks in the dust as I went. Every step echoed through the building, as if it resented the disturbance. I explored the offices first. Desks still had phones on them, drawers half open with files inside. A half-drunk coffee cup sat in one corner, dried out and stained. There were personal effects, 2 photos of families, potted plants now dry and brittle calendars stuck on a month I didn't recognize. It was like everyone had just walked away one day and never returned. Down the hall, I found the holding cells. Empty, for the most part. Bars rusted, doors left ajar, with worn blankets and thin mattresses still inside. One cell had strange markings on the wall, tallies scratched into the paint, hundreds of them, trailing from one corner to another. It was unsettling, but not enough to make me leave. Not yet. I found the evidence locker behind a heavy steel door. It wasn't locked. The handle turned with a groan, and I pulled it open to reveal shelves lined with bags and boxes. Some of them were torn open, their contents scattered across the floor. Others sat neatly in their place, each marked carefully with a tag, the handwriting faded but still legible. The air inside was stale and cold, as if it had been waiting for someone to open it again. I moved closer, scanning the labels. Most were ordinary wallets, pocket knives, phones, and keys. Then I saw the section marked personal effects. The bags here were different, larger, and inside I could see clothing, stained dark with what I realized was dried blood. Some had holes torn through them. Others looked like they had been cut away hastily, as if in an emergency. One bag caught my attention. It was marked with a number and a date, but no name. Inside was a neatly folded white dress shirt, stained dark from the collar to the hem. A wedding ring rested on top of it, still threaded through the chain of a thin necklace. I lifted the bag carefully, turning it in my hands. The ring was engraved on the inside, a name and a date. I couldn't help but wonder who it had belonged to. I checked another. This one contained a torn flannel shirt, a pair of jeans, and a matching ring, slightly larger. The dried blood was crusted thick around the waistband. There was also a wristwatch, cracked but still ticking faintly, as if it had only recently stopped keeping time. It was all too personal, too intimate. These were not just pieces of evidence. They were parts of lives that had ended badly. As I moved further down the row, I saw more bags like them. Always blood-stained clothes, always a ring or sometimes two. The tags offered no real clues, just numbers, dates, and the words personal effects. But the sheer number of them made my stomach twist. Dozens lined the shelves, maybe more. It was hard to tell where they ended, the light not quite reaching the far corners of the room. I found a logbook on a small metal table. The entries were brief, just dates and case numbers. Some had the word closed stamped next to them in red ink. Others were left blank, as if they had never been solved. Flipping through the pages, I saw a pattern. Most of the cases had been logged in the last few years before the station closed. The dates clustered together, months at a time, sometimes only weeks apart. Something else caught my attention on the final pages. There were scribbled notes in different handwriting, frantic and uneven. No records in central, one line read. Another said, "Nobody reported missing." And at the bottom of the page, scrawled in thick, heavy letters, was a question: who are they? I stood there for a long time, staring at the words, feeling the weight of them settle on me. Whoever had worked here last was just as confused as I was. These people hadn't been reported missing. No one had come looking for them. Yet here were their clothes, their rings, their belongings carefully collected and stored. I turned back toward the shelves, counting the bags again in my head. There were too many. Far too many. I started to wonder how this place had stayed open as long as it had. How no one had raised any alarms. But the longer I stood there, the more I felt like maybe someone had. Maybe that's why the station had been abandoned so suddenly. As I backed toward the door, my flashlight flickered. For a second, the beam cut out entirely, leaving me in darkness. When it came back on, I thought I saw movement at the far end of the locker. Just a shift of shadow, something too quick to follow. I didn't wait to see what it was. I shut the door behind me, the latch clicking louder than I expected. I made my way out of the station, moving faster now, the empty room suddenly feeling less empty. I thought I heard footsteps more than once, but when I turned, there was nothing. I didn't stop until I was outside, breathing hard, the late afternoon sky looking much darker than it had when I arrived. Driving away, I kept glancing in the rearview mirror. The station sat back from the road, its windows dark, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something had been watching me from inside. I don't know why the personal effects were left behind. I don't know what happened to the people they belonged to, and I don't think I'll ever go back to find out. Story 19. I came across the house by accident. I had been hiking for hours farther off the trail than I should have been, when I noticed the blackened remains through the trees. The walls were mostly gone, but a few charred beams still jutted up from the stone foundation. The ground was littered with ashes and splintered wood, and the air smelled faintly of smoke, though the fire had clearly happened a long time ago. Curiosity pushed me closer. There was no driveway or path leading to the ruin, no sign that anyone had lived there recently. It felt strange, like the forest had grown around it too quickly, almost as if trying to hide it. I stepped over broken boards and rusted nails, picking my way toward what was left of the front door. Inside, the floor was covered in debris. Burnt furniture lay in broken heaps, and the walls were black with soot. I moved slowly, watching where I stepped. My boots crunched on shattered glass, and every noise seemed too loud in the hollow space. There was something unsettling about how quiet it was, how the forest sounds didn't seem to reach inside. Toward the back of the house, I found a staircase leading down. The door to the basement hung crooked on its hinges, and the stairs disappeared into darkness. I hesitated, telling myself it wasn't worth it, but something about the emptiness above made me wonder what had survived below. I took out my flashlight and carefully made my way down. The basement was cooler. The air felt heavy, as if it hadn't been disturbed in years. My light swept over cracked concrete walls, old pipes, and a dirt floor. At the far end of the room, there was a single chair. It sat in front of a wall but was completely covered in photographs. I walked toward it slowly, the beam of my flashlight trembling slightly. The chair was wooden and simple, but it looked out of place in the ruin, as if it had been left for a reason. Its legs were sunk deep into the dirt, like someone had been sitting there for a long time. I stood behind it and turned my attention to the wall. The photographs were old, the edges curled and brittle. They showed the house as it must have been before the fire. In one photo, the house stood bright and white against a clear sky. In another, there was a family standing on the front porch, but the faces in every picture had been erased. I leaned in closer. It wasn't like someone had scratched the faces out or blurred them. There was just nothing. Smooth skin where eyes, mouths, and noses should have been. In every image, the people stood in familiar human poses, smiling, waving, but their faces were blank, featureless. I took a step back, my stomach twisting. There were dozens of these photos, maybe hundreds. Some showed birthday parties, others family gatherings, but all of them had the same eerie absence. I felt an overwhelming sense of being watched, though there was no one else there. On the ground by the chair, I noticed something else. A camera, old and covered in dust, lay on its side. I picked it up and examined it. The film compartment was empty, but it felt heavy, like it had been used recently. For a second, I debated whether to take it with me, but something deep down told me not to. I turned to leave, but a sound made me stop. It was faint, almost like a breath, coming from behind me. I swung the flashlight back toward the wall, but nothing had changed. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was different. The air felt wrong, like the room was smaller somehow, closing in. I hurried back toward the stairs, my pulse quickening. As I reached the steps, I heard a creak from behind. I didn't look back. I climbed faster, nearly slipping on the uneven boards. When I reached the top, I slammed the basement door shut and backed away. Outside, the forest seemed darker. The wind had picked up, and the trees swayed like they were whispering to each other. I made my way back through the ruins and toward the woods, but the feeling of being watched didn't leave me. Every time I glanced over my shoulder, I thought I saw movement among the blackened beams. The hike back took longer than it should have. I kept losing my sense of direction, the trees blurring together in the dim light. I felt like I was being led in circles, always ending up closer to the house than I wanted. My legs ached, and I fought the growing panic in my chest. Eventually, I found the trail again. The familiar path steadied my breathing, but I didn't slow down until I was back at my car. Even then, I locked the doors immediately and sat for a long time before starting the engine. The forest loomed quietly around me, the house hidden once more behind the trees. That night, I couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the faceless figures in the photographs. I kept thinking about the chair in the basement, about how it had faced that wall as if whoever sat there had been watching for something to change. I wondered if someone had sat there for hours, days, or longer. A few days later, I developed a roll of film from my hike. I hadn't thought much about it until I flipped through the photos. There were shots of the trail, the trees, and then one of the house. It hadn't been on fire in the photo. It looked new, white, and clean, exactly like in the old pictures on the wall. The last photo was of me, sitting in the chair, staring at the wall of photographs. My face in the image was smooth and blank, featureless like the others. I threw the photos away, but sometimes I wake up at night and swear I hear footsteps in the hallway. And when I look in the mirror, for just a second, I think I see nothing staring back. Story 20. The theater stood at the end of a narrow, crumbling street, its facade weathered and stained by time. Its marquee, once lit with bright bulbs, hung crooked over the sidewalk. I had passed it a dozen times on my way through town, but today something drew me in. The doors were unlocked, heavy wood groaning as I pushed them open. Inside, the air was thick with dust and the faint scent of mildew. Rows of tattered seats faced a darkened stage, and broken lights hung from the ceiling like dead stars. The place had been closed for years, yet it felt like it was only waiting for someone to walk in. My footsteps echoed as I crossed the cracked tile floor, each step louder than I expected. I made my way down the main aisle, glancing up at the balcony. Torn curtains hung like cobwebs. The silence pressed in heavy and close, but I kept going. Something about the place felt expectant, like it had been waiting for me. Behind the stage, a hallway led to the dressing rooms. The door creaked as I pushed it open, revealing a narrow corridor lined with peeling paint. Old posters and photographs curled on the walls, their subjects faded and smiling faintly from another time. I moved quietly, not sure why I was whispering to myself to stay calm. The first dressing room was empty except for a cracked mirror and a broken stool. Dust coated the floor, undisturbed by footprints. But when I tried the second door, it opened easily. Inside, the lights above the mirrors flickered faintly, even though I was sure the place had no power. Costumes hung from racks along the walls, some elegant and elaborate, others tattered and strange. Each one had a small tag pinned to it. I stepped closer to read them. They were names first and last written in neat, careful handwriting. At first, they meant nothing to me. Then I saw one that made my breath catch, my name, spelled exactly as I write it, even down to the middle initial I rarely use. The tag hung from a dark jacket, styled like something from an old play. Beneath it, neatly folded, were pants and shoes that looked about my size. I stared at it for a long moment. I hadn't signed in anywhere. I hadn't told anyone I was coming here. My stomach twisted as I reached out and touched the fabric. It was cold, colder than the air in the room, and it felt wrong beneath my fingers. I backed away slowly, but something caught my eye on the makeup table. A small book lay open, pages filled with more names. Each one had a role written beside it: hero, villain, chorus. I flipped through, my fingers shaking slightly. Every page was filled, but when I reached the last entry, I found my name again. The role next to it was blank. A noise from the hallway made me freeze. It was soft at first, like the shuffle of footsteps on an old floor. I turned toward the door, holding my breath. Nothing moved, but the sound came again, slower this time. Someone or something was walking down the corridor. I closed the book and stepped back, glancing once more at the costume that bore my name. I didn't want to turn my back on it, but I had no choice. As I edged out of the room, I heard something creak behind me. I didn't look, I just moved. The hallway was dimmer now. The old lights flickered low, casting shadows that seemed to twist along the walls. I moved toward the stage door, but something drew my eyes to another dressing room on the left. Its door was half open, and light spilled from within. Against my better judgment, I pushed the door the rest of the way open. Inside, more costumes hung on racks, but these were different. They were older, dustier, as though they hadn't been touched in decades. Yet each still had a name pinned to it. Some were scratched out, others smeared with something dark. On the floor beneath them lay shoes, arranged in pairs, some with broken laces and others worn nearly to threads. I saw a pair that looked like mine, scuffed in a way that felt familiar, but I had never been here before. My pulse pounded as I stepped back, heart racing. Something shifted in the mirror across from me. A reflection that wasn't mine stared back. It wore the costume with my name on it, and though its face was pale and hollow, its eyes followed me. I stumbled away from the door, slamming it shut behind me. I ran back toward the main theater, toward the faint promise of daylight through the entrance. The air seemed thicker now, harder to breathe. My footsteps echoed behind me as though someone was following, matching my pace exactly. When I burst out into the main auditorium, I stopped cold. The seats were no longer empty. Figures sat in them, still and silent, dressed in faded costumes. Their faces were pale, their eyes glassy and dark. Some turned toward me as I stood there frozen. On the stage, the curtain rose slowly, revealing a single chair. A spotlight shone down on it, and something told me it was meant for me. I took a step back, but the door behind me slammed shut, the sound making me jump. The auditorium remained silent except for the faint creak of the curtain swaying. I didn't want to look back at the stage, but I did. The chair was still there, waiting. My name was stitched into the fabric of its cushion, as clear as day. I turned and ran along the edge of the room, toward the side exit I had noticed earlier. It was locked, but I shoved against it until the wood splintered and gave way. I stumbled outside into the blinding afternoon light, gasping for air. I didn't stop running until the theater was a distant shape behind me. Even then, I could feel eyes on my back, watching, waiting. I haven't been back since, but sometimes I find myself dreaming of that stage, and the chair with my name on it, still waiting in the spotlight. Story 21. The hike to the old observation post wasn't on any map. I had found it marked by hand in a local history book one picked up at a flea market. The ink was faded, but the trail was there, winding through dense forest toward a ridge overlooking the valley. I set out early, hoping to reach it by mid-afternoon and maybe get some photos before the light faded. The path was rough, overgrown in places, and the deeper I went, the quieter it got. I heard no birds, no insects, just the crunch of my boots on dry leaves. After an hour of steady climbing, I spotted the structure through the structure. It was a squat, concrete bunker half sunk into the earth and covered in moss. A rusted metal door hung crooked on its hinges. I stepped inside and found the air cooler, thick with the scent of damp stone and old metal. Narrow slits in the walls served as windows, offering narrow views of the valley below. A wooden desk stood against one wall, its surface cluttered with notebooks and yellowed papers. Everything was coated in a fine layer of dust, as if no one had been there in years. The logbooks were stacked neatly in the center of the desk. Their covers were cracked and brittle, the pages inside stained with age and water damage. I flipped through one, the handwriting neat and deliberate. The first entries were standard observations, movements in the valley, weather reports, the occasional sighting of enemy troops. Nothing unusual until midway through the second book. The handwriting changed slightly, a little more hurried. The entries mentioned figures moving through the trees at night, but not soldiers. The descriptions were vague, tall, unnaturally thin eyes that reflect light but consistent. The soldiers wrote about hearing sounds that didn't belong, clicks and whistles that echoed too long in the dark. I read on, feeling the temperature drop with every page. The entries became more frantic, some only a few words long. Watched us all night. Won't answer the radio. Figures at the window. It was clear they were seeing something regularly, something they couldn't explain. The last logbook was thinner, the handwriting almost illegible, but the dates were recent enough to make my chest tighten. The second to last page listed their final watch rotations, as if they were trying to stay organized despite everything. And then the last entry. The handwriting was jagged, the words pressed deep into the paper, there inside. There was no date, no signature, just those two words stark against the yellowed page. I closed the book slowly and listened. At first, there was only the sound of my own breathing. Then something else. A faint scrape from the back of the bunker, like wood on stone. I stood up too fast and the chair behind me toppled over, clattering loudly in the quiet space. I froze, waiting for the sound again. It came, softer this time, followed by something that might have been a whisper. I backed toward the door, my pulse thudding in my ears. I told myself it was just the building settling, old wood shifting. But the whisper came again, clearer now. A word I couldn't make out, spoken just above the edge of hearing. I stepped outside and felt the air shift, colder than before. The trees were still, not even a breeze moving through them. I wanted to leave, but something kept me rooted in place, staring back at the dark doorway. Part of me wondered if those men had imagined everything they wrote. If they'd been stuck out here too long and gone stir crazy. But then I saw movement in the corner of my eye. It was near one of the slits in the concrete, where the shadow didn't quite match the angle of the light. It stayed still for too long, like it was waiting. Then it pulled back, quick and smooth, like it knew I had seen it. I stumbled away from the door and made for the trail, keeping my eyes on the treeline. I didn't hear footsteps, but I felt watched the whole way down. I only stopped when I reached my car, parked at the edge of the forest. The silence followed me there, heavier now. I drove home with the windows up and the radio off, half expecting to see something in the rearview mirror. But the road stayed empty, and I tried to convince myself it was over. That night, I spread the photos out on my kitchen table. Shots of the bunker, the valley, the logbooks. In one of them, a figure stood in the trees behind the bunker. It wasn't there when I took the picture, I was sure of that. It was tall, thin, and pale against the dark woods. Its eyes reflected the flash from my camera. I didn't sleep. Every sound in the house made me sit up and listen. I checked the locks twice, pulled the curtains closed tight. But sometime after midnight, I heard something on the porch. A click, followed by a low whistle that didn't belong. When I looked through the peephole, there was nothing there. The next day, I burned the logbooks and the photos. It didn't feel like enough, but I didn't know what else to do. I haven't gone hiking since. Sometimes I still hear that whistle in the middle of the night, though. faint like it's far off but getting closer. Story 22. I had been driving for hours through an empty stretch of highway when I spotted the diner. It sat just off the road, its windows boarded up and paint peeling from the walls. The parking lot was cracked, weeds pushing through the asphalt, but there was something about the place that made me slow down. Maybe it was curiosity, or maybe it was the uneasy feeling that I was being watched and needed to be somewhere I could stop for a minute. I pulled in and killed the engine, sitting there for a moment as the ticking of the cooling engine filled the silence. The wind blew gently, pushing loose gravel against the tires. After a moment, I grabbed my flashlight and stepped out of the car. The air smelled stale, like old oil and rust, and something I couldn't quite place. The front door of the diner hung slightly open, its hinges rusted and creaking softly with the breeze. I hesitated before pushing it wider and stepping inside. The air was thick with dust, and the faint smell of something rotting clung to the walls. Tables were still set, faded napkins and utensils placed neatly, like the customers had just stepped away. I walked further in, shining the light over the counter and booths. Everything was coated in grime, but otherwise, it seemed untouched. That was when I noticed the menus. They were lying on each table, laminated, but stained in places, and every one of them was filled with names. Each item listed a name and a date beside it, like John Keller, 06-1791, or Marcy Tillman, 11-03-84. Some of the names had small descriptions beneath them, things like well done or served cold. My stomach twisted the more I read. It didn't make any sense. It wasn't right. At the very bottom of one menu, I saw a line printed in red. Today's special, U. The word U was handwritten in thick, uneven strokes, the letters slightly smudged as if someone's hand had trembled while writing it. I put the menu down and stepped back, suddenly aware of how quiet the diner was. Too quiet. I turned toward the counter and saw an old register, the kind with mechanical buttons. Behind it was a doorway leading into the kitchen, the swinging door hanging at an angle. I thought about leaving right then, but something pushed me forward. Maybe it was stupid curiosity or just the idea that I needed answers. I pushed through the door and stepped into the kitchen. The smell was worse there, sour and metallic. Pots and pans hung from hooks above counters, most of them covered in a thick film of grease and dust. There was an industrial-sized refrigerator in the corner, its door cracked open. I took a deep breath and pulled it wider. Inside were empty shelves, but scratches lined the metal walls, deep grooves like something had clawed at them. The floor beneath the fridge door was stained dark, and I couldn't tell if it was rust or something else. I let the door swing closed and stepped away. On the prep table in the center of the room was another menu, this one different. It had only one item listed, my name, and today's date. I froze, staring at it, my pulse pounding in my ears. I hadn't told anyone I was coming this way. There was no way anyone could have known. The hairs on the back of my neck rose as I heard the faint sound of footsteps above me. Slow, deliberate, moving across the ceiling. There shouldn't have been a second floor, but the sounds were unmistakable. I backed toward the door, trying not to make a sound. The footsteps stopped. For a long moment there was nothing. Then, a loud crash came from the other side of the diner, like something heavy falling onto one of the booths. I didn't wait to find out what it was. I turned and ran back through the kitchen door, past the counter, and toward the entrance. But when I reached the doorway, the door was no longer open. It was shut tight, boards nailed back across it as if they had never been removed. My breathing quickened as I turned, looking for another way out. There were windows behind the counter, but thick boards covered them too. The lights in the diner flickered suddenly, even though I hadn't seen a power source when I entered. They cast harsh, cold light across the room, revealing things I hadn't noticed before. Smears on the walls, handprints, and long streaks of something dark dragged across the floor. My heart pounded in my chest as I backed away from the door. Then I saw movement. A figure stood in one of the booths at the far end of the diner. It was tall, thin, and pale, its head cocked slightly to one side like it was studying me. I couldn't make out its face, but its eyes seemed to shine faintly in the dim light. It didn't move at first, just stared. I edged back toward the kitchen door, keeping my eyes on the figure. But when I blinked, it was gone. I turned and bolted through the kitchen again, searching for anything that could be an exit. There was a back door, but it was bolted shut with a thick steel bar. I tried pulling at it, but it wouldn't budge. Then I heard the footsteps again. Closer this time, slow and dragging, moving through the kitchen toward me. My flashlight flickered as I scanned the room, searching for anything I could use. I grabbed a rusted knife from the counter, the handle slick with grime, and backed into the corner. The swinging door creaked open, but there was no one there. The footsteps stopped, and the room fell silent. I held my breath, gripping the knife tighter. A whisper broke the silence, close to my ear. "You're today's special." The voice was cold and hollow, and I felt something brush against the back of my neck. I swung the knife wildly, but there was nothing to hit. I ran back to the bolted door, slamming my shoulder against it again and again until the metal bar finally broke free. I stumbled outside into the night, gasping for breath as the cold air hit me. I didn't look back. I ran to the car and fumbled with the keys, starting the engine with shaking hands. As I pulled away from the diner, I looked in the rearview mirror. The figure stood in the doorway, watching me. The boards on the windows and door seemed to vanish as it stepped forward, but it didn't follow. It just stood there until I was out of sight. I drove until the sun came up, not stopping until I reached a town miles away. But sometimes when I close my eyes, I can still hear the whisper. And I still have the menu I found in the kitchen, no matter how many times I try to get rid of it. The date keeps changing, and now it's tomorrow. Story 23. The military base had been abandoned for decades. It sat at the edge of a dense forest, surrounded by rusted fences and weathered signs that warned trespassers to stay out. I had driven past it many times, always wondering what was left inside. One cold afternoon, curiosity got the better of me, and I decided to find out for myself. The gate was hanging off its hinges, making it easy to slip through without much effort. The place was eerily quiet, except for the sound of my boots crunching the gravel beneath my feet. The buildings were gray and lifeless, windows shattered or boarded up. Most of the structures were simple, blocky bunkers and barracks, their doors gaping open like mouths that hadn't spoken in years. I wandered past rows of crumbling walls and faded signs, stopping occasionally to peek inside buildings. Most of them were empty, filled with little more than dust and the remains of old furniture. There were papers scattered on the floors, some too faded to read, others that made no sense out of context. After an hour or so of exploring, I came across a bunker that looked different from the rest. Unlike the others, this one was sealed tight. A thick iron door was locked from the outside with a heavy bar, rusted but still holding firm. There were deep scratches around the edges, as if someone or something had tried to force it open from the inside. I stood there for a moment, wondering why this bunker had been treated differently. Something about it made me uneasy, but I couldn't walk away. I tested the bar, and to my surprise, it shifted under my hands. It took some effort, but I managed to wrench it loose and set it aside with a loud metallic clang. The door creaked open slowly, revealing a narrow hallway that led into darkness. The air that rushed out was cold and damp, carrying a faint, sour smell that made my stomach twist. I switched on my flashlight and stepped inside. The concrete walls were stained and cracked, the floor coated with a thin layer of dirt. As I moved deeper into the bunker, the beam of my light swept over something that made me stop in my tracks. Footprints. Fresh ones. They were clear in the dust, leading away from the door and disappearing around a corner up ahead. I crouched down to take a closer look, brushing my fingers over the edges of the prints. They weren't old. There was no sign of smudging from dust settling over them. Someone had been in here recently, maybe even today. The thought made my heart pound in my chest, but I pressed on, driven by a mix of fear and curiosity I couldn't explain. The hallway opened into a larger room, the walls lined with empty shelves and broken equipment. In the center of the room, on an old metal table, lay a small black notebook. It was the only thing in the room that didn't look like it had been abandoned for years. Dust hadn't had time to settle on it. It was as if someone had just placed it there. I walked over slowly, the sound of my footsteps echoing in the silence. The cover of the notebook was worn, the corners frayed from use. I opened it, half expecting the pages to be empty. Instead, there was a single sentence written in the middle of the first page. The handwriting was messy, as if it had been scribbled in a hurry. It read, "They lied." I stared at the words for a long time, waiting for them to make sense. They didn't. There were no other entries in the notebook, no explanations, just that one simple phrase. I flipped through the rest of the pages, but they were blank. It was as if the message was never meant to be anything more than that. I set the notebook down and took a step back, suddenly aware of how quiet it was. Too quiet. I turned in a slow circle, scanning the room with my flashlight. That's when I noticed something I hadn't seen before. Another set of footprints, smaller than the first ones, leading from the far side of the room to another doorway I hadn't noticed when I first walked in. The door was slightly ajar, a faint draft coming from the gap. I hesitated, then walked toward it, pushing it open with the edge of my boot. The room beyond was even darker, the walls narrowing into what looked like a storage chamber. On the floor, arranged in a neat row, were several pairs of boots. Some looked military-issued, others looked civilian. Each pair was placed carefully side by side, as if waiting for someone to claim them. I felt the hair on the back of my neck rise. There was no dust beneath the boots. Someone had placed them there recently. I backed out of the room slowly, not wanting to turn my back on it. Once I was back in the main chamber, I grabbed the notebook and turned to leave. The message felt heavier now, like it was meant for me. As I walked back down the hallway, I kept checking over my shoulder, half expecting to see someone or something following me. But there was nothing. Just the echo of my own footsteps and the sound of my breathing, quick and shallow in the cold air. I made it to the door and stepped out into the fading daylight, pulling the heavy bar back into place once I was outside. I stood there for a while, staring at the sealed bunker. Part of me wanted to open it again, to go back and search for answers. But another part of me knew better. Some things weren't meant to be understood. Some truths were buried for a reason. I left the base without looking back, the notebook tucked under my arm. That night, I couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw those footprints in the dust and the neat row of boots in the dark. And the words in the notebook echoed in my mind over and over again. They lied. Story 24. The factory sat on the outskirts of town, its smokestacks long cold and crumbling against the gray sky. I'd heard stories about it, rumors passed between people who never seemed to speak louder than a whisper when they mentioned it. Most said it had been abandoned for decades, but no one knew why it had closed. The gates hung open as if inviting me in, and against better judgment, I parked my car just inside the rusting fence and started toward the main building. The place was massive up close, with shattered windows and sheets of metal clinging to rotting wood. The smell was sharp and metallic, and though the air was still, I felt as if something were moving beneath the silence. I found a door with its hinges half torn away and stepped through into darkness, the beam of my flashlight cutting a narrow path through the gloom. The factory floor stretched out in front of me, rusted machinery hunched over as if bowing under their own weight. I moved slowly, the floor creaking beneath my boots. Some of the equipment still had tags hanging from them, yellowed with age, the handwriting long since faded. The sound of dripping water echoed from somewhere deep inside the building, but I couldn't figure out where. Every so often, my light would catch on something reflective, broken glass, a twisted piece of metal, and I'd have to remind myself to stay calm. After a while, I found a set of metal stairs leading up to an office suspended over the main floor. The paint on the door was peeling, but I could still make out the faded lettering that read Foreman. I hesitated before pushing it open, half expecting it to be locked, but it swung in easily on silent hinges. The room was dark, except for a shaft of light cutting through a broken window and spilling across the far wall. The air inside was different, heavier somehow. Dust covered everything, thick and undisturbed. A metal desk sat near the window, papers scattered across its surface, some fluttering faintly in the draft. What caught my attention first, though, was the wall directly behind it. Dozens of photographs were pinned there in uneven rows, curling at the edges as if they had been hung a long time ago. I stepped closer and felt my stomach tighten. Every photo showed a person, each one inside what looked like a steel cage. Some of them were standing, gripping the bars tightly, their faces pale and desperate. Others were sitting on the cage floor, their heads lowered or their eyes fixed directly on the camera. There was no expression of hope in any of them, just resignation, fear, or exhaustion. The cages were uniform, with heavy locks and bolted frames. Each photo had a date written in red ink along the bottom edge, and many of them were clustered around the same few months. The faces changed, but the setting was always the same, a gray, windowless room with harsh lighting that threw deep shadows on the floor. I turned away and looked at the desk, hoping for some kind of explanation. There were blueprints spread out over its surface, brittle and cracking at the edges. The words human containment were printed in block letters across the top of each one. I traced a finger along the lines, seeing cells laid out in rows, corridors leading between them, and what appeared to be observation rooms at regular intervals. There were notes scribbled in the margins, technical details about locking mechanisms and ventilation systems. One note simply read max capacity, 200. I flipped to another sheet and found diagrams for restraints, shackles bolted to the walls, metal chairs with straps at the wrists and ankles. It was detailed and precise, drawn up like any standard construction plan, but it made my skin crawl. I searched through the drawers of the desk and found more folders, each one labeled with initials and numbers. Inside were lists of names and dates, along with small photographs paperclipped to each page. The photos were similar to the ones on the wall, people in cages, their expressions vacant or terrified. Some of the papers had additional notes about compliance or transfer readiness. The deeper I went, the worse it got. One file had a map showing a network of underground tunnels leading away from the factory, with notations marking holding areas and delivery points. Another described procedures for long-term storage, including guidelines on sunshine and nutrition. It was clinical, detached, as if the people being described were nothing more than inventory. I heard a noise, then soft, but distinct, a creak of movement somewhere nearby. I froze, listening hard. The air seemed to thicken, and for a long moment there was only silence. Then it came again, closer this time. Slow, deliberate footsteps on metal stairs. I killed my flashlight and backed away from the desk, my breath catching in my throat. The footsteps reached the landing outside the office door and stopped. I could hear the faint rasp of breathing, steady and unhurried. Whoever it was stood there for several long moments before continuing on down the walkway, their steps fading into the distance. I waited, counting each second, until I was sure they were gone. I turned the flashlight back on and took one last look at the photos on the wall. Some of the faces seemed to look back at me differently now, their eyes following as I moved. I hurried out of the office, careful not to make too much noise. Back on the factory floor, I stuck to the shadows, my pulse hammering in my ears as I made my way to the exit. Once I was back outside, I didn't stop moving until I was behind the wheel of my car, locking the doors and gripping the steering wheel with white knuckles. The factory loomed behind me, dark and silent again. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something inside it had noticed me, something that didn't want me to leave. I drove straight home, but sleep didn't come easy. Even now, I sometimes wake in the middle of the night, convinced I hear that slow, steady breathing just outside my door. I think about the blueprints and the cages and wonder if there are other places like that factory still running somewhere, places where the lights are still on and the cages are still full. Story 25. The fishing lodge sat by the edge of a quiet lake, miles from the nearest town. Its roof sagged under the weight of years, and its windows were dull with grime. The dock had collapsed into the water long ago, and weeds grew high around the posts. When I stepped out of my car, the only sound was the faint rustle of wind through brittle grass. I had heard about the place from an old map I found at a flea market. The lodge wasn't listed on modern guides or online. Curiosity had brought me out here. Something about the place drew me in, though I told myself it was just the mystery. The front door was slightly ajar. I gave it a push, and it groaned loudly on its hinges as it swung open. Inside, the air was cold and smelled of damp wood and mildew. The floorboards creaked beneath my boots, each step raising faint clouds of dust. The walls were covered in fishing gear, old wooden rods, rusted hooks, tangled nets, and lengths of rope. Some of the hooks were huge, the kind meant for deep-sea fishing, glinting faintly even in the dim light. They hung from nails driven into the walls in no particular order, like a collection no one had touched in years. I walked slowly through the main room, past a long wooden table where someone had once cleaned fish. The stains on the wood were dark, impossible to tell if they were old blood or something else. An old scale hung from a beam, swaying slightly as if moved by an unseen hand. There were cabins out back, smaller than the lodge but still standing. I thought about checking them out but decided to look upstairs first. The staircase was narrow and steep, with ropes strung along the banister. They weren't decorative. They were tied in knots I couldn't name, loops hanging down just far enough to brush my shoulder as I climbed. Upstairs, the rooms were mostly empty. Dust lay thick on the floor, and broken furniture was pushed up against the walls. In one room, the window was shattered, letting cold air blow through. But something was sitting on a small desk by the wall, its edges yellowed with age. It was a journal, leather-bound and cracked, the pages stiff and brittle. I picked it up carefully, brushing away the layer of dust. The handwriting inside was neat, written in black ink that hadn't faded much. It wasn't a fishing log like I expected. It was something else entirely. The first few entries seemed normal enough: descriptions of the lake, notes about fish caught, weather observations. Then the tone changed. One entry described a man who had wandered into the lodge during a storm. He'd been cold and hungry, and the writer had offered him food and shelter. Later, it mentioned how catching him was easier than expected. I read on, feeling my stomach tighten with each page. The entries described more visitors, some campers, some hunters, others just lost. The writer detailed how they had been lured inside, trapped and weighed. There were strange references to gutting and cleaning that didn't seem to involve fish, but the phrase that came up most often was catch and release. I kept reading until one passage stopped me cold. "Released another one today," it said. "Back into the world, with hooks still inside. You never know who might pull you back in." I closed the book slowly, feeling the coldness of the room settle into my bones. When I looked up, I noticed something I hadn't seen before. There were ropes strung along the ceiling, knotted in strange ways, loops dangling here and there. Some of them looked fresh, as if they'd been tied recently. And there was something else, a faint sound like wood creaking under a shifting weight. I backed away from the desk and the journal. The floorboards under me groaned loudly, and I froze. The creaking sound wasn't me. It was coming from downstairs. I couldn't tell if it was footsteps or something else moving around the main room. Quietly, I crept toward the stairs. I leaned over just enough to see the ground floor. The door I'd come through was still closed, but the ropes on the walls were swaying gently, as if brushed by something passing too close. I moved as quietly as I could down the stairs, my hands cold and sweating despite the chill in the air. As I reached the bottom, I saw that one of the hooks from the wall now hung low on a length of rope, swinging slowly back and forth. I didn't wait to find out who or what had set it in motion. I went straight for the door. My hand was on the knob when something stopped me. The journal was open on the table by the door. The page turned to an entry I hadn't read yet. It was dated today. "Another visitor has arrived." The catch was simple: soon the release. I ran. The door groaned open as I pushed through, the wind outside biting hard against my skin. I sprinted toward my car, heart pounding so loudly I could hear it in my ears. Behind me, the ropes on the porch swung out, some of them snapping as if tugged by invisible hands. I got in the car and locked the doors with shaking fingers. The keys slipped once before I jammed them into the ignition. As the engine turned over, I glanced at the lodge one last time. In the upstairs window, something moved, a pale shape shifting back into the shadows. I didn't stop driving until I was well past the tree line, the lake and lodge long out of sight. Even then, I kept checking the rearview mirror, expecting to see someone or something following me down the road. But there was nothing, just the trees and the empty road. That night, when I finally made it home, I found something on the front seat. A loop of rope, knotted tight, with a rusted hook threaded through the end. I hadn't brought it with me. I hadn't seen it when I got in the car, but it was there now, waiting. Story 26. It took me most of the day to hike to the old quarantine station. The trail was overgrown and nearly invisible in places, but I'd studied old maps and followed what was left of a faint path through the woods. As I climbed higher, the air grew still, heavy with the scent of damp earth and moss. By the time I reached the clearing, the sun was dipping low, casting long shadows across the broken fence that circled the facility. The station was a cluster of low, whitewashed buildings, weathered and streaked with mildew. Windows were cracked or missing entirely, and doors hung crooked on rusted hinges. I hesitated at the entrance, taking in the silence that blanketed everything. It wasn't the peaceful quiet of nature, but something closer, heavier, like the air just before a storm. I stepped inside the main building, boots crunching on old plaster and broken glass. The reception area was small, with a wooden desk and a wall-mounted sign listing procedures that had long since faded. The dust was thick, untouched for years. I moved slowly, careful not to make more noise than I had to. Beyond reception was a narrow hallway. Rows of doors lined each side, all marked with numbers. I chose one at random and pushed it open, expecting to find bare floors and empty walls. Instead, I found a room that looked almost untouched by time. The bed was still made, the blanket tucked tightly under the mattress, as if waiting for a patient to return. I moved closer and saw the shackles attached to the bed frame. Thick iron cuffs on heavy chains, bolted directly into the wood. They lay open now, but there was no question what they had been used for. I ran my fingers lightly over the smooth metal, wondering who had last worn them and why they had been necessary. I checked the other rooms and found the same thing. Beds perfectly made, shackles ready and waiting. Some rooms had small tables with empty water pitchers and glasses. Others had only a chair in the corner. There was no sign of struggle, no blood, no damage. It was as if everyone had simply vanished, leaving everything exactly in place. I found the patient files in an office at the end of the hall. The cabinets were still full, neatly organized, the folders brittle with age but otherwise intact. I pulled one out and flipped through it. Name, age, symptoms, each entry was methodical, clinical. Fever, delirium, violent behavior. Then at the bottom of every single page, the same note in red ink. Deceased, unknown cause. I kept going, pulling file after file, hoping for something different, but they were all the same. Dozens of patients, maybe more. All dead, no explanation. The handwriting in some changed as I moved through the records, but the final notation was always identical. Unknown cause. There was no mention of where the bodies went, no details about what had been done after death. I wondered if they had been buried on the grounds or cremated, or if something else had happened that nobody had thought to write down. A chill ran through me, and I rubbed my arms, suddenly aware of how cold it had become inside the building. I found a staircase that led to the basement. The steps creaked under my weight, and the air grew damp and stale the further I descended. At the bottom was a heavy door that stood slightly ajar. I pushed it open and found a large room lined with metal tables. Restraints were bolted to their edges, stained dark in places I didn't want to think about. Cabinets stood against the walls, some open to reveal shelves lined with jars containing things I couldn't identify. I didn't stay long down there. The air was too thick, and the smell was something sour and wrong. I climbed back upstairs quickly, feeling the weight of something unseen following behind me. By the time I reached the main floor again, it was nearly dark outside. The windows were black, reflecting nothing but my own pale face. I didn't want to stay, but I felt like I had to see the rest. I crossed to another building, one that looked like it might have been an isolation ward. The doors here were heavier, reinforced with metal bars. I stepped inside and found more rooms, more beds, more shackles. But these were different. The walls were scratched, deep grooves dug into the plaster and wood. Some were long and jagged, others neat rows of tally marks. In one room, I found a message scrawled on the wall above the bed in what looked like dried blood. It simply said, "Don't open the door." I didn't know which door they meant, but I turned and left that room immediately, glancing over my shoulder as I went. I found an old medical journal in another office. The pages were brittle and yellow, but I could still make out the writing. It wasn't official records like the patient files. These were personal notes, observations. The handwriting grew more frantic as the pages went on, until the words became nearly illegible scrawls. There were drawings too, rough sketches of things that didn't look entirely human. The last entry was just a single line. "It's still in the walls." I closed the book slowly and put it back where I found it. My hands were shaking now, but I forced myself to stay calm. I told myself it was just an old place. Nothing was alive here anymore. But as I stood there, I heard something. A soft scraping, like fingernails on wood. It came from behind the wall to my left. I backed away slowly, keeping my eyes on the wall as I moved toward the door. The sound followed me, always just behind the plaster, growing louder with each step. By the time I got outside, the sky was completely dark. The forest around the station was silent, not even the usual night sounds of insects or birds. I started walking, not quite running, but fast enough that I was breathing hard by the time I reached the tree line. I didn't stop until I was halfway back down the trail, and even then, I kept glancing over my shoulder. I never saw anything, but that scraping sound followed me all the way back to my car. It was faint at first, then louder, and finally it seemed to be inside my own head. I left that place behind, but I've never really escaped it. Sometimes in the middle of the night, I hear the same sound coming from inside my walls. A slow, steady scraping, and when I check the walls in the morning, there are fresh marks. Story 27. I had always been drawn to abandoned places. There was something about the silence they held, the forgotten stories left behind in their empty halls. So when I heard about the deserted convent on the outskirts of town, I knew I had to see it for myself. The locals didn't talk much about it, but I found a few old maps that showed its location deep in the woods. It took me half the day to reach it. The path was overgrown and choked with brambles, but eventually the trees parted and revealed the convent's crumbling stone walls. The building was larger than I expected, its gray stone streaked with moss. The windows were dark, some broken, others boarded over. The wooden doors at the entrance were warped but still intact, hanging slightly ajar as if they were waiting. Inside, it was quiet in a way that pressed against my ears. Dust hung in the air, swirling in the shafts of weak light that filtered through cracks in the walls. I walked through the main hall, my footsteps echoing off the high, arched ceilings. Long wooden benches stood in neat rows, though many had collapsed or rotted away. At the far end was the chapel, its altar still mostly intact, though the white cloth draped over it was stained and torn. I spent hours exploring the convent. The sleeping quarters were small, each room no bigger than a closet, and most were empty. Some still had personal items left behind: rosaries, old books, a few photographs yellowed with age. It felt strange, seeing these things untouched for years, as if their owners had simply walked away one day and never returned. The air smelled faintly of mildew and something older that I couldn't quite place. Behind the chapel, I found a door that led to a garden. The iron gate creaked loudly as I pushed it open. The garden had long since become wild, weeds twisting around broken statues and crumbling fountains. Beyond the garden was a small cemetery. Dozens of wooden crosses rose from the overgrown grass, their wood gray and splintered. Each grave had a simple marker, no names, just dates carved into the wood. At first, I didn't notice anything strange. It wasn't until I walked closer that I realized something was wrong. Every grave bore the same date, July 3rd, 1952. row after row of identical dates, stretching out in every direction. The sight made my skin crawl, though I wasn't sure why. It was as if something terrible had happened here all on the same day, and no one had ever spoken about it. I knelt down to look closer. The carvings were shallow, but they looked fresh compared to the age of the wood, as if someone had returned years later and marked them again. I found no signs of flowers, no offerings left behind. The graves felt abandoned, just like the convent itself, but they also felt watched, as if something unseen lingered close by. I stood there for a long time, staring at those dates. The silence was heavier now, the kind that made it hard to breathe. I turned back toward the chapel, feeling suddenly exposed in the open yard. My footsteps sounded too loud as I walked back to the door, but I told myself it was just nerves. Places like this had a way of playing with your senses. Inside the chapel again, I noticed something I hadn't seen before. Near the altar, there was a trapdoor set into the stone floor. It was partly hidden beneath a rotting carpet. The wood of the door was stained dark, and the iron handle was rusted but still solid. I hesitated for a moment, but curiosity got the better of me. I grabbed the handle and pulled. The door opened with a groan, releasing a gust of cold, damp air. A narrow stone staircase led down into darkness. I turned on my flashlight and carefully made my way below. The walls were damp, slick with moss, and the air smelled of earth and something metallic. At the bottom of the stairs was a small stone chamber. Along the walls were shelves lined with old books and jars filled with unidentifiable things. At the center of the room was a stone slab, and on it lay a book. The cover was cracked leather, its surface marked with strange symbols I didn't recognize. I flipped it open, careful not to tear the fragile pages. The writing inside was a tight scrawl, the ink faded but legible. It wasn't in any language I knew, but the drawings told enough of a story. There were diagrams of the chapel, the garden, and the graves beyond. And then there were drawings of figures in long robes, gathered around what looked like the very slab I stood before. Their faces were hidden, but their hands held knives, and around them were other figures bound and kneeling. The last page was a single symbol, drawn over and over in dark ink until it bled through the paper. I backed away, feeling sick. I didn't know what had happened here, but it wasn't the peaceful life of a convent. Something darker had taken place beneath these stones, something the graves outside only hinted at. I climbed back up the stairs, closing the trapdoor behind me, though it felt like shutting a lid on something that was still alive. The light outside had faded by the time I stepped back into the garden. The graves seemed closer now, as if the rows had shifted while I was underground. I hurried back through the garden gate, past the chapel, and through the front doors of the convent. The woods felt safer, though not by much. I didn't look back until I reached the main path again. At home, I tried to find more about the convent. There was almost nothing. A few articles about its founding in the early 1900s, and a short mention of its closure in the 1950s due to unforeseen circumstances. And nothing about the graves, nothing about what had happened on July 3rd, 1952. Sometimes late at night, I wonder about those graves, why they were all marked the same, who laid them there, and what became of the ones who had done it. I have no plans to go back to that place, but part of me knows that whatever happened there isn't finished. It's waiting, somewhere beneath the chapel, for someone else to find it. Story 28. The drive up to the cabin had been quiet, the kind of quiet that starts to feel unnatural after a while. I hadn't passed another car in nearly an hour, and the road kept twisting upward through dense woods. My phone had long since lost reception, but I told myself that was part of the appeal. No distractions, no noise, just a weekend alone to clear my head. When I finally arrived, the cabin was exactly as it had been described in the listing: simple, old, but sturdy. There was a stone chimney, dark wood walls, and a wide porch with a view of the valley below. I parked the car, stepped out, and stretched, listening to the wind move through the trees. The air smelled cold and clean, and for a moment I felt like I'd made the right choice. Inside, the cabin was small but comfortable enough. A single room with a bed, a table, a fireplace, and a tiny kitchen in the corner. Everything was clean, though there was a thin layer of dust on the windowsills. I dropped my bag by the bed and took a slow walk around, getting a feel for the place. It creaked in the way old cabins do, but nothing seemed out of place. I built a fire in the hearth, made myself something to eat, and sat at the table with a book. As the sun started to set, the forest beyond the windows grew darker and the cabin filled with shadows. That was when I first noticed the carvings. They were on the inside of the window frame, hidden unless you were sitting close enough to the glass. At first, I thought they were just scratches in the wood, the kind that comes from age or animals clawing outside. But as I leaned in, I realized they were names. Dozens of them, carved in neat rows, with little check marks beside many of them. Some of the names were old, worn down until they were hard to read. Others looked fresher, more recent, the wood still pale where it had been cut. I ran my fingers over the names, reading them slowly. None of them were familiar to me, but the check marks made me pause. Not every name had one, but most did. And then I saw my own name, carved low in one of the columns. The letters were sharp and clean, as if someone had carved it within the last few days. There was no check mark next to it, not yet. I pulled my hand away, staring at it. I told myself it was a mistake, maybe a coincidence. A common name, maybe. But deep down, I knew that wasn't true. The carving was too fresh. Someone had been here recently, and they had known my name. I stepped back from the window and checked the door, making sure it was locked. Then I went to the other windows, making sure they were closed tight. I told myself it was just some sick joke by whoever owned the cabin, a way to scare guests. But the longer I looked at those names, the less sure I was. That night I didn't sleep well. Every creak of the wood, every snap of a branch outside made me sit up and listen. I kept the fire going, more for the light than the warmth, and stayed close to it. I checked my phone again, but there was still no signal. I thought about packing up and leaving right then, but the road was steep and narrow, and driving it in the dark didn't feel safe. At some point I must have dozed off because I woke to the sound of something moving on the porch. Slow, deliberate steps. I stayed perfectly still, holding my breath as I listened. Whoever it was, they didn't knock. They just moved along the boards, pausing every few feet like they were listening for something inside. I waited until the sound stopped before creeping to the window. I pulled back the edge of the curtain as carefully as I could and looked out. There was nothing there, just darkness and trees. But I noticed something else. My name on the window frame now had a faint mark next to it. Not a full check, just the beginning of one. Like someone had been interrupted before they could finish. I backed away from the window and grabbed my bag. I didn't care how dark the road was. I wasn't staying another minute. I threw on my jacket and yanked open the door, stepping out onto the porch. The air was bitter cold, and the forest was dead silent. I hurried to the car, fumbling the keys with shaking hands before finally getting the door open. As I started the engine, my headlights swung across the trees. Something moved there, fast, slipping deeper into the woods before I could get a good look. I didn't wait. I turned the car around as best I could and started down the mountain, tires skidding on gravel and dirt. The road was worse than I remembered, but I kept going, not daring to stop. It took hours to get back to anything like civilization. By the time I reached a gas station with a working phone, the sun was coming up. I called someone to come meet me, too rattled to drive any further. When they arrived, they asked where I'd been. I didn't know how to explain it. I just said I'd made a mistake going up there alone. Later, I tried to find that cabin again. I looked for the listing online, but it was gone. No records, no contact info. I even drove back toward where I thought it had been, but I couldn't find the turnoff. It was like the place had disappeared. Sometimes I wonder how long my name had been there before I saw it. If someone had carved it while I slept that first night. And I wonder what would have happened if they'd had the chance to finish the checkmark. Story 29. The field stretched out for miles, golden and quiet under a pale sky. I had been walking for hours, following an old dirt path that cut between patches of trees and rustling grass. It was the kind of place where time felt stuck, where you wouldn't be surprised to find something left behind. That's probably why I noticed the old metal hatch sticking up from the ground. It was almost hidden by weeds, its edges crusted with rust. I stood over it for a moment, thinking about whether or not I should open it. There was something strange about finding a storm shelter way out here, where there weren't any houses or farms in sight. But curiosity got the better of me, and I crouched down to wipe away the dirt. The handle groaned loudly when I tugged on it, stiff at first, but then giving way. The hatch opened with a reluctant screech, and the smell that came up was stale, but not as bad as I expected. I pointed my flashlight into the dark, revealing a narrow set of concrete steps leading down. It looked stable enough, so I took a breath and started to descend. The air was cooler inside. The walls were plain, poured concrete with no markings or signs of life. But as I reached the bottom of the stairs, my light swept across something unexpected. Shelves, dozens of them, lining the walls in perfect rows, all filled with metal cans. I walked closer. Each can was the same size and shape, but the labels were handwritten in thick, black marker. The writing was neat, almost too neat, and every label had a name and a date. Some were names I recognized, common ones like John or Sarah, but others were odd, names I'd never heard before. I picked up one of the cans and turned it in my hands. The label read Thomas H. May 14th. It didn't say what was inside, but the weight was solid, like any other preserved food. On the shelf above it, I saw another can with the word consumed scrawled in red beneath the date. The longer I stood there, the more wrong it all felt. The names stretched on for what seemed like years, the dates spanning decades. Some of them were crossed out in thick lines, others underlined. I found cans marked from the 1950s sitting next to ones dated just last year. I set the can down carefully and moved deeper into the room. It wasn't just shelves. At the far end, there was a long table, clean and empty, except for a ledger resting open at its center. I flipped through it slowly, my fingers hesitant on the yellowed pages. The entries matched the names on the cans. Each one listed a name, a date, and something else I couldn't quite understand. Words like arrived, prepared, and processed repeated over and over. Some names had notes beside them. Did not cooperate. Quiet. Lasted 3 days. I closed the book and stepped away, my pulse quickening. It felt like I had wandered into something I wasn't supposed to see. But I wasn't ready to leave yet. Not until I understood what was happening here. Near the table, there was another door. It was heavy, metal like the hatch above, but this one wasn't rusted. It was clean, almost new. I pressed my ear against it but heard nothing on the other side. Against my better judgment, I turned the handle and pushed it open. The room inside was colder. There was a hum, low and steady, coming from somewhere I couldn't see. Along one wall were more shelves, but these held jars instead of cans. I moved closer and felt my stomach twist. Inside each jar was something unidentifiable. Some floated in cloudy liquid, others pressed against the glass as if they'd been crammed inside too tightly. I backed away quickly and shut the door behind me. Whatever this place was, it wasn't just a storm shelter. It was something older. Something that had been used for a long time by people who had a reason for labeling those cans the way they did. I returned to the main room and ran my fingers across the shelves. There were hundreds of names here, maybe more. Some of the more recent cans had names I thought I recognized from the nearby town. A couple of them even had today's date written on the label, followed by a waiting. That was enough for me. I climbed back up the stairs, my flashlight beam jittering as I moved faster. When I reached the top, I heaved the hatch closed and stood there for a minute, catching my breath. The field was quiet again, the wind moving gently through the tall grass. I tried to convince myself it was all just something old and forgotten. Maybe an eccentric person's idea of survival prep. But the dates didn't lie. Some of those cans were marked today, and I couldn't shake the feeling that whoever had written those labels was still around. I left the field and walked quickly back toward the road. The light was fading, and the sky had turned a pale gray. I told myself I wouldn't mention this to anyone. It was better that way. People disappear sometimes. You hear about it on the news, but now I wondered how many of them ended up in places like that shelter. That night, I couldn't sleep. Every sound outside my window made me sit up and listen. In the morning, I checked the locks twice before I left my house. As I walked through town, I passed by the bulletin board at the corner store. Tacked among the flyers and ads were missing person notices. Some of the names looked familiar. One of them was Thomas H. I remembered the date on his can. It matched the day he disappeared. I haven't gone back to the field since. I'm not sure I ever will. But I keep thinking about those shelves and all the cans waiting there, lined up neatly. I wonder if my name will ever end up on one, and if it does, whether it will say awaiting or consumed. Story 30. The slaughterhouse sat at the end of a long dirt road, hidden by trees and tall weeds. Its rusted metal siding had faded under years of sun and rain, and most of the windows were cracked or broken. I had passed by it before, but curiosity finally got the better of me that afternoon. With my car parked a ways back, I walked the last 100 yards on foot, the gravel crunching beneath my boots. The front doors hung open just enough for me to slip inside. It was cooler in there, the air damp and carrying a faint metallic scent that hadn't left even after years of disuse. The concrete floor was cracked in places, and the paint peeled from the walls in wide, curling strips. My footsteps echoed as I moved deeper into the building, the quiet pressing in heavier the farther I went. I found the kill floor without much trouble. The massive room opened up suddenly, brightened by holes in the ceiling where sunlight poured through. To my surprise, the floor was spotless, smoother and cleaner than anything I'd expected from an abandoned building. There were no stains, no debris, no signs of dust even. It was as if someone had scrubbed it recently. The hooks still hung from overhead rails, swaying gently even though there was no wind inside. I stood under one and looked up, watching it spin ever so slightly. The silence was unsettling, like the room itself was holding its breath. Something about the place didn't feel right, but I made myself keep going. On the far wall, I noticed what I thought was old graffiti at first. But as I got closer, I realized they were photographs. Dozens of them, maybe hundreds, carefully arranged in neat rows. They covered nearly every inch of the wall, from just above the floor to nearly touching the ceiling. Each one was printed on glossy paper, pinned in place with small nails. I stepped closer to study them, and that's when my stomach twisted. The photographs were all of people. Some men, some women, a few children. Each one was chained to one of the hooks I had just walked beneath. Their expressions ranged from fear to numbness. None of them looked like they were asleep. They looked like they were waiting. I leaned in and saw dates written in the corner of every photo. They were recent. All of them were from the past year. Some were only a few weeks old. The handwriting was small and precise. A black marker pressed hard enough to leave dents in the paper. I took an involuntary step back, feeling the weight of all those eyes staring down at me from the wall. I kept scanning the photographs, hoping for some kind of explanation, but there wasn't one. No names, no signs, just pictures and dates. Some photos showed the same person from different angles. In a few, their heads hung low, as if they'd lost the energy to hold them up anymore. In others, their eyes were wide, mouths open in silent screams. I turned away, feeling sick, but something on the opposite wall caught my attention. Another set of photos, arranged differently. These were older, yellowed around the edges. The people in them wore older clothes, and the images had a grainy quality like they were taken with an old camera. But they were posed the same way, chained to the hooks, heads tilted or hanging. Something about these older photos felt worse, like whatever had been happening here had gone on longer than anyone would have guessed. My pulse pounded in my ears as I tried to make sense of it. I didn't want to be there anymore, but my legs wouldn't move just yet. I glanced up at the ceiling, looking for cameras. If someone was taking these photos, they had to be watching. The longer I stayed still, the more I felt like I was being watched right now. I started walking back toward the exit, moving faster than before. My boots slapped against the clean concrete, each step feeling too loud. When I reached the hallway leading back toward the entrance, I stopped. There were footprints on the floor now. They hadn't been there before. They led from the kill floor to one of the side rooms I hadn't checked earlier. The footprints were wet, as if someone had stepped through water or something thicker. I didn't want to follow them, but curiosity pushed me again. I edged toward the door at the end of the prints. It was partly open. Inside, the room was dark except for a narrow window that let in a shaft of pale light. In the center of the room stood a metal table. On it was a pile of chains, neatly coiled. The walls here were bare except for more photographs. Smaller ones this time. They looked like surveillance stills, people getting out of cars, walking down streets, sitting in restaurants. Some of them were circled in red marker. My stomach dropped when I realized a few of them looked familiar. One was of me sitting outside a gas station 2 towns over just a few days ago. I backed out of the room, shaking now, and turned to leave. As I did, the sound of metal scraping against concrete came from behind me. I didn't look back. I ran. Down the hallway, past the spotless kill floor, through the front doors that banged open wide as I pushed through them. Outside, the light felt too bright. I sprinted back to my car without stopping, not even when I thought I heard footsteps following me. When I finally reached the driver's seat, I fumbled with the keys and got the engine started on the 3rd try. I didn't look back until I was miles away. Even now, I think about those photographs. The way some of those people looked right into the lens, like they could see the person behind it. Like they knew what was coming. Sometimes I wonder if my picture is hanging on that wall now, dated for today or tomorrow.